Is that okay for everybody? Is that a decent...
Can you everyone see?
Okay, that's fine. Okay, good. So, tonight, I hope to give you... The purpose of this talk is to give you some tools to think about rhetoric. So I think this course has something to do with rhetoric. Yeah, is that right, Sam?
It's called the Rhetoric of Labor.
Well, yes, okay. So that's something to do with the rhetoric of labor. So I can't help you with the labor part, but I can definitely help you with the rhetoric part. Rhetoric is something that I don't think I have a convicted sense of what I think it is. But you might. So the way I'd like to start is what I'd like you to do is either on your computer or you're taking notes or your notebook, just anywhere, write down a definition of rhetoric that you think what it means. Have you guys have heard this term before, I'm sure.
They had a class, I went over the whole syllabus. Must have mentioned rhetoric sometime in the first class.
Yeah. But just write it down, take a minute or so, write down what you think it means. Because this will be incredibly helpful for the way we'll proceed through the talk tonight. And thinking about what rhetoric can be, what it is, or what people have thought it was. And just because someone has thought that rhetoric is a particular thing, or a particular practice, or a particular value, it has not stopped people from coming up with their own senses.
I'll tell you, if you pronounce it rhetoric, which every once in a while I get someone that pronounces it, I'd like to take the rhetoric of the labor class. I'm like, yes, you should take that course. If not, for the only reason to learn how to pronounce rhetoric. But I'm always...
Is that the exam? Is that the exam?
I'm always concerned that at the end of the semester they're still saying rhetoric. Mm-hmm. I'm like, you didn't learn much, did you? Pronounce rhetoric.
Yeah, the word rhetoric is a Greek word. It has a Greek root, rhetoros, which means an orator, somebody who's speaking. And pretty much the history of Western rhetoric, which is I think what you're going to deal with in this class, comes from ancient Athens, which is what we usually call ancient Greece. We think about, yay, democracy, the birthplace of democracy, yay, except women, slaves, and foreigners couldn't participate. But yay, democracy.
Oh, you mean the Trump plan?
Yeah. Bringing Athens back. Hashtag bringing Athens back. But that's what we usually think of. But ancient Greece was not a unified country or unified. They had similar cultural things. They shared a language and religion and things like that. But Athens was the place that we would call the birthplace of Western rhetoric. It's not as if ancient China or ancient Japan or ancient India didn't have rhetorical traditions, but they just didn't call them that. They called them other things. So there's been a lot of work done on that kind of stuff. But tonight, we're going to focus on that Western trajectory and where rhetoric came from. So what are some of the definitions you guys have come up with? Anybody want to share? So that Sam and I can say you're wrong? No, I'm just kidding.
Yeah. Wrong? Oh, okay. Just kidding.
Communication through the use of symbols and how those symbols change the way we view the world.
Good. You guys like that one?
Did that come from the textbook?
Yeah.
Yes.
Who's the textbook? What's your textbook?
Foss.
Oh, Foss and Trap?
Well, it's just Foss. Sonia Foss wrote by herself.
Oh.
She broke up the band and wrote her own.
She did break up the band. It's always like Foss and Griffin, Foss and Trap. So. Okay. Yeah, no, that's a great definition. It's not necessarily the one I would adhere to. Anybody else? What do you think rhetoric is? What's your understanding of it? You hear it in the media. You hear it in the news. With all these Republican debates going on. And then they have these hidden Democratic debates that are like I think it's like the hidden levels in a video game. It's like, oh man, did you see the Republican debate? It's like, no, I was too busy playing that secret level. The Democratic debate, which was on at 3:30 in the morning on a Sunday on PBS. And it was 30 minutes long. You're like, what? How'd you find that? They're so well hidden. But the Republican debates are like everywhere. You can't escape. But oftentimes you'll hear people use rhetoric in terms of that. They'll say, their rhetoric was good, but what's their actual policy? Or they'll say, the rhetoric behind the plan needs to be cut through. We need to figure out what Rubio's policy really is, or what Bush's policy really is. And then we have the greatest rhetorical moment of the last couple of weeks, which is Jeb Bush speaking in front of supporters and talking about how he's going to be tough on terrorism. And then they all sat there, and he said, "Please clap." Did you guys see this?
No.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Do you want to see it? We can
Yes,
watch
I
it.
would love to
Okay.
see it. I didn't see
We
it.
should check it out then.
You want us to find it for you?
Oh, I could find it. I
Don't
did
use
mean
my
to
mouse.
put it into the thing, but I didn't have the time. It should be pretty easy to find.
Yeah. How's everybody doing?
Great.
I have a couple questions. The energy level is very low in here. What can I do to improve the energy level? Perhaps institute drug testing? What would help? I'm being serious. What would help to jazz this class up? Or is this like the new thing? Yes,
You
amazing.
can end class.
Have class outside?
No, just end.
And right now?
Everyone go out.
That would jazz class up?
Yeah.
Okay. No.
Yeah, it's
It means you're banned from talking anymore. In this class, the remainder of the semester. Anybody else have an idea? Do you have classes where everybody's excited to be there? Yeah.
In oceanography, they play a song at the start of every class.
Oh, that's a good idea.
Eagle today.
Yeah. Okay. I'll play a song.
I have a friend of mine who does
assignment. You have
walk-up
to play a song.
music for his class. Isn't that ridiculous?
What did you play?
Walk-up music, like in baseball.
Oh, really?
When somebody comes up to bat, they play their music. And anytime before you taught, he would play.
Yeah.
And then he'd come in the classroom and be like,
In my debate class, I played a song now.
"Oh,
Yeah.
good. All right, you guys ready? This is my favorite rhetorical moment of the past couple of weeks. And then we're going to talk about why you might think it's rhetorical. I hope nobody's like people who feel the embarrassment of others and it makes them feel awkward, because it's going to do that to you.
Can you make it bigger?
So here's my pledge to you. I will be a commander-in-chief that will have the back of the military. I won't trash talk. I won't be a divider-in-chief or an agitator-in-chief. I won't be out there blowhard, talking a big game without backing it up. I think the next president needs to be a lot quieter, but send a signal that we're prepared to act in the national security interests of this country, to get back in the business of creating a more peaceful world. Please clap.
Can you turn that back on? Do that scene
Yeah,
one
you
more
want to see
time.
it again?
Yes.
So here's my pledge to
Make
you.
it big too.
I will be a commander-in-chief
All right.
that will have the
I
back of
want
the
you
military.
to find out who
I
this
won't
kid
trash
is,
talk.
because his
I won't
energy
be a
level
divider-in-chief or an
reflects the rest of
agitator-in-chief.
you.
I won't be out there blowhard, talking a big game without backing it up. I think the next president needs to be a lot quieter, but send a signal that we're prepared to act in the national security interests of this country, to get back in the business of creating a more peaceful world. Please clap.
Someone has their hand
So
up.
here's-
A Bush supporter. Very
Yeah.
upset.
I was saying, there's a similar gap.
Yep.
Gap with Marco Rubio. Have you seen that one?
Mm-hmm. Is that the one where with the water?
No, he says, let's dispel the notion that Obama doesn't know what he's doing, and he knows exactly what he's doing, but he repeats that as a broken record 4 times within 2 minutes.
Yeah. It's a little strange. You wonder who's advising these people and what it is that what it is they're getting out of that information. But as far as that Bush moment goes, or we can use Rubio too, what's particularly rhetorical about that moment? There's a lot of things in that moment that stand out to me as a rhetorician that you could say, these are like basic rhetorical concerns. Yeah.
That speech is a symbol of the fact maybe he's just not the puppet master, but the puppet.
Yeah.
He's just figuring out everything. Doesn't think for himself.
So that entire speech, that entire video clip, can itself be a symbol that can be rhetorically deployed to say, he's a puppet, he doesn't know what he's doing, somebody else is pulling the strings. You had your hand up?
Yes, I was going to say...
Right here, and then you.
Oh,
Yeah.
I was going to say that I guess it kind of shows that the way you speak can be a symbol for how the audience is supposed to respond, and obviously he didn't match that kind of way.
Yeah, right. He's like, they're supposed to clap,
Yeah.
and the audience is like, we only clap when we feel like it. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Well, yeah, I was saying, like, he's talking about being a strong commander-in-chief. We need a commander-in-chief that's, going to put America back on the map, a quiet one that doesn't bully anybody, and, commander-in-chief that's supposed to inspire, leadership and trust. But it's kind of ironic that, he's saying all this, but he doesn't inspire the people, and they reluctantly clap after he, begs them to.
Yeah.
So I don't think he really has the support of the common citizens. Please like that.
Mm-hmm.
I also think it might have been a smitheroo just to hold up a sign and clap. That was especially begging.
Yeah. He was a little depressed, I think. A little sad.
It's also just a microcosm of what people are probably already feeling about Jeb at this point, right? He's just he's everything and nothing all at once. He was the kind of the front runner. If you asked someone 2 years ago, a year and a half ago, everyone thought he was the most legitimate guy.
Mm-hmm.
Now his campaign's on the rocks. He may not even make it to South Carolina.
Did anybody see him come here 2 years ago when he spoke at Bailey Hall? Yeah. Do you know how much they paid him to come here and speak for an hour? When he was the front runner 2 years ago?
How much?
$100,000. Right? And he had all these special things. They had to have a special driver for him. They had to have special food and all this other stuff.
Did they use our tuition money to pay for him?
Well, it's no longer your tuition money.
You're all now proud Jeb supporters, so use the hashtag with pride.
Yeah.
I don't know how that works.
They used some of the money the Cornell Republicans got raised, but a lot of the money came from what's called the programming board that brings concerts and stuff like that. It was a well-attended event, but I feel now no one would pay him $100,000. I mean, he's not an inspiring speaker. You expect the person to be a good speaker on top of everything else. Also, let me just ask you a show of hands. How many people here, not that any of you are excellent, amazing speakers, but would know at least enough not to ask the audience to clap? Yeah. I mean, I just think that's intuitive. How bad do you have to be to have to ask the audience to clap?
What do you think? Let me ask you another question about that. I mean, I agree with what Sam is saying, but let's think about it in a more cynical way, knowing what we know about modern politics. Do you think those people just walked in off the street? No? Where did they come from?
They've been his supporters.
They're his supporters. Do you think they paid a good amount of money to sit there and watch him speak?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, and why are they filming it? Is it just for those supporters, a special reward for them? Or why would there be a camera there?
Wants to be a commercial?
Maybe a commercial.
It's a news event. It's right before the Iowa caucuses.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, big thing for Iowa. They know it's going to... Does Jeb Bush and his people have in mind that we are the audience for that? So, is it the audience that's sitting there, and then there's the audience on YouTube of millions, and then there's the audience of us sort of laughing at it, but they can't possibly predict that, but they're thinking in terms of audience, and that's one of the fundamental things that rhetoricians are concerned about, is thinking in terms of audience, and there's going to be a lot of that I'm going to talk about tonight, as opposed to any other metric that one could think about a situation. Rhetoricians think about audience. That's probably one of the top things. The other things you guys are saying, message, that's another thing we think about. Meaning. But it's how is meaning created? How is meaning created? How do we agree upon meaning? And why does disagreement upon meaning create so much strife in the world? That's another thing we think about quite a bit. So I'll share with you my definition of rhetoric at the end. It's a pretty simple one. The one I have today. But, you ask me in a few days, I might have a different one. It's always sort of changing. But this concern about audience and message is an important one. So Jeb Bush is thinking about, not about his audience there, but his audience there is part of his message, which might have been something you were thinking about. He was like, they need to clap now because that's going to look good to the actual audience. These people are already convicted, I would say. They already like him. They probably paid $1,000. Why don't you come and sit in the front row at a Jeb Bush speech? That'd be a cool thing to do. Yeah.
There's a lady in the back who tried to clap her daughter's hands, and then she stopped.
Yeah.
I don't know if you saw that.
Yeah, I did see that. What do you think was going on there?
She realized that nobody else was doing it.
Yeah, and that pressure affected it. And that happens sometimes. I don't know if you guys have ever been to the orchestra, but you know how they'll play a song in movements, and so that's why they give you the program. There'll be that one person who didn't read the program. And the first movement ends, and they're like, because you're not supposed to clap between the movements. So there's that social pressure on her, even though she kind of realized she should clap then. Is he doing things to kind of push the audience in that direction? No, I didn't really feel it, but there could be some signs of it. Yeah.
I think in his mind, he was prompting the audience, like he tried to raise his voice and like he used his hands more. So I think he thought he was sending the signals, I'm getting excited, you should too. Mm-hmm. But as the audience, it was like, you're not even close to the energy level.
Yeah, I mean, that's another important thing to think about in rhetoric is the status of intent. Intent is completely irrelevant in the study of rhetoric. What you mean and what you intended to have happen doesn't hold any weight. It's usually the audience and the situation are going to govern that. What you intended something to mean is not really what's going to come out of it.
But what if you're trying really hard? And they tell you afterwards, I know I'm not a very good speaker, but I was trying really hard.
Sometimes that can be really rhetorically savvy, sometimes not. Begging people to clap is probably not very savvy. But sometimes that works with an audience to say, I'm very new at this. I'm kind of an outsider. I'm not this kind of thing could work. I'm kind of an outsider. I'm not really a polished politician like you'd see in Washington. Kind of new at this kind of thing. I'm not really a campaigner, but I do know a few things.
Given that both my brother and my father were president.
Yeah. Now this isn't going to work for Jeff. You'd be like, I'm from a backwater state. We don't really see a lot of people unless they're going to Disney World. This kind of thing. It's not going to work. But for some politicians, it might work. For others, they don't have that luxury to that recourse. For some of them, if they did that, you'd think something was really up. Right? So even if you intend something good, or you say, I didn't intend for my statement to mean that, that doesn't matter in study rhetoric. Whatever circulates goes. And a lot of people spend a lot of their lives fighting against meanings that circulate that they didn't intend by saying, I didn't intend for you to take it that way. But then they took it that way.
Do you ever get students, this happens to me a lot at Cornell, that come and ask for a higher grade, and then they say, but I tried really hard.
Yeah.
And what do you say to them?
I say, well...
okay, here's a high grade.
No. But I appreciate your effort. But you should have come to me sooner in the semester, is usually what I say. So we could come up with a plan. We can't come up with a plan the day before the university closes for the holiday.
Yeah, I have a question about what you just said.
Yeah.
Do you think it's possible for a presidential candidate to not be a great public speaker, or not be an entertainer? I feel like that's the standard for even Jeb Bush. Maybe he has the best experience or whatever, but because he can't speak, will he ever get that support?
Yeah, this is a great point, but I also really want to focus in on the split between great speaker and entertainer and how those things are almost equivalent. The way you use the terms. I don't know if that's what you intended, but as the audience for what you said, that's what I'm getting. Great speaker, entertainer. But we've had presidents, terrible speakers but great entertainers, like George W. Bush, for example. Right? Terrible. But the things he says, we just laugh about, and they circulate, and then comedians make fun of them, and all this. I'm the decider. I decide, and we have a bunch of Americans out there working hard, trying to put food on their family.
My favorite one. Oh, go ahead.
And then, my favorite one was when he was at a rally and somebody was asked a question. It was like, I'm from East Texas. He's like, oh yeah, my wife Laura, she's from East Texas. She's an East Texas girl, just like me. That was my favorite.
My favorite one was he was talking to a group of people and he was trying to explain how OBGYNs get too many legal malpractice cases, and he's like, we need to get the government out between OBGYNs and the woman they love. and it totally came across like the OBGYNs were molesting the patients.
That's a pretty good one. But so he was a bad speaker, but a good entertainer, right? A bad speaker. But then you say he's a bad speaker, but it really depends on the audience. Some people say that's not the way a president should sound. And then some people would say, good. Good. Because we don't need some slick politician, somebody who's trying to trick us, somebody who sounds too polished. We need somebody who's somebody who we can trust, somebody from who sounds like I do. And there's a very, very important person in the history of rhetoric, Aristotle, and he talked to his students about the importance of style, the importance of being able to speak in different languages, not like French, German, but the way that people from a particular region would expect you to sound if you were from that region. And one of his students took it so seriously, he went around Athens, which was a really big city, like New York City at the time. And in the different neighborhoods of Athens, there are different accents. Just like in New York City, right? Staten Island, Brooklyn, Queens, all that. And so this guy went into an area where he was practicing his accent and talked to someone and said, "Can you give me directions to such and such?" And she's like, "Why are you asking me that? You clearly grew up here with the way you talk." And he was like, "Yes." So it's like learning how to speak like those people. Using the correct, incorrect grammar is incredibly important. Understanding that correct usage is a marker of more than just correct usage. An accent is a marker of a lot of different things. And to be able to speak in a way that people feel like you're from them or among them is an incredibly important thing. And that's why George W. Bush was so successful. So, but I don't know if you can have, people who aren't good public speakers. It's a hard question to answer because it really doesn't matter how good they are on an objective level. And in the study of rhetoric, we don't really have the sense of objective rightness. We have the audience. We have the audience. And whatever the audience is doing is interesting to us. So we sort of live in the space between audience and speaker. And actually, it's moved beyond that now. I showed you YouTube. Who's the audience, who's the speaker. We could say YouTube is the speaker. Or we could say that video is the message. The whole thing. Not just Jeb Bush. But the entire thing is what we're the audience for. And some scholars would say, there's never a time in your daily life where you're not an audience. You're not being audienced by something. Like right now I'm an audience for all these wonderful Mac advertisements, right? I see that Apple everywhere I look. In the back, somebody, yes, sir.
Yeah, I was going to say, isn't the reason why politicians and candidates, rely more on speech and effective use of rhetoric is to appeal to the pathos? Is that to the pathos of the audience?
Mm-hmm.
Because they don't really rely on logical explanations of their policy, but they rely on heightening emotional tension and getting the crowds to clap and getting them riled up. Isn't that what politicians try to go for nowadays? And why we need more of an entertainer?
I mean, the only thing I would dispute is nowadays. Like, you're sort of hearkening back with this kind of nostalgia for a time that might not have been, Like, I don't know if we ever had, logical politician, that does not compute, this kind of thing. But
well, because I was thinking back to the first Nixon-Kennedy debate.
Yeah.
How, that was a big deal in the television world because, people that were listening to the radio, they heard Nixon talk and Kennedy speak, and in their minds, they were pulled and they were saying that, Nixon won the debate, he came across as a more experienced speaker, but yet on television, when people said debates, they were saying that JFK won the debate because Nixon, he was sweating, he looked very unscruffled, and Kennedy came across as very professional and very well prepared, and that's something how perceptions impact what we think of candidates.
Yeah, perception is huge. You're absolutely right. The perception of a candidate is huge. Think about Howard Dean. I don't know if you remember, but he was doing quite well, and then he had this speech where he got really excited and started talking about how they were going to conquer the U.S. Like, they were going to Florida. They were going to South Carolina. They were going to... And then he just screamed really loud. He's like, yeah! And it sounds kind of like the scream that the animals make when you kill them in a video game, or the bad guys. Like, if this is really, really weird. And it got repeated over and over again in the media, and people started to question the stability of Dean. They started to question. They said, "Is that scream appropriate? Is it appropriate for a presidential candidate to do that?" And he was on the defensive, but they didn't play the rest of the speech. They just played that scream over and over again. And eventually, audiences began to associate Howard Dean with this noise, this animalistic cry of victory and joy.
Has everybody seen that famous? Yeah. Can you just show it real quick?
Yeah, sure, I can.
Yeah. Also, I just want to correct something. I just had an article published on CNN.com. Do you know that website? It's relevant. I'm not just saying that. That is about that very thing that you brought up, the Nixon-Kennedy debates. That story that you just told about how people that watched it on TV thought this, and people that heard on the radio thought this other thing. That is a total urban legend. That did not really happen. And if you Google my name, like Sam Nelson and CNN, you can read the article. You will join 250,000 people that also read that article at 250,000 hits. So I'm very glad that you brought that up, so I could talk about my most recent CNN article.
Yeah, the research on the Kennedy-Nixon debate is bad. So there's a scholar, I think his name is David Vansel, if you want to look it up. I can send the link to Sam. But there was scholarship done on this, and they said that...
It's in my article. I have a link.
Oh, yeah? Oh, okay. Yeah, the all we had was sort of a mail-in thing from a magazine.
The magazine
who do you think?
advertising today.
Yeah, who do you think won, and how did you listen to it? And they didn't really have a good response rate. But I think the study says more about our fears about the control that we perceive that media has over our thinking than anything else. And I think people have that fear. You have that fear among your teachers, yes? About the presence of laptops in the classroom, the presence of mobile phones in the classroom, the presence of mobile phones on the campus. It frightens them. And it frightens them not because you're getting something wrong, but it's an unknown quantity how these things change the way you think and the way you look at stuff. I mean, I'm a big fan of all this stuff, but...
See, he's weird. We were having this conversation. He's like, I love the fact that they're multitasking. They're doing a million different things in the classroom. I'm like, I don't know why you go that far. And then I told him that, like, when I go teach I teach at a maximum security prison. When I go in there, they don't let me take my car keys because it's an electronic key, and they're like, someone could grab that and send a message with your electronic key.
Yeah, like unlock the door.
And I was like, no, they can't. I mean, I don't care if you put an MIT electronic professor in prison. They're not going to be able to turn a key fob into, like, a keyboard, right? And they're like, well, you don't know. They got a lot of time on their hands. And then he used Steve in our conversation. We shifted from who was better, Socrates, Aristotle, to this conversation. And then Steve was like, yeah, that just is exactly what we were just talking about. The prison guards fear the unknown technology. Yeah. They don't really understand it. That's like you, Sam, and you fear, like, they're, maybe they're doing Facebook on their computer, maybe they're watching the NBA game, maybe they're texting someone on their phone. They're not paying attention to you. And I'm like, oh.
Yeah, it's kind of a spurious connection that to pay attention one would need a distraction-free environment. It might be the distractions that help you process. Like the fear is based on a substantive thing, which is these things are communicating with you. They're doing something. They're doing something to your thinking. They're doing something to it. They have some effect, powerful effect, and we're not really sure what that is. And the change might not be, but the ideal of the distraction-free environment might not be the best place to learn. It might actually be better to learn to be Facebooking and buying shoes and typing some notes and thinking. You never know. I don't know. The jury's out, I think, on all that. But it definitely helps you keep your mind on what might be going on in an environment. Like, you're going to be in an environment in the workplace where you're going to have all these things demanding your attention at once. So here's the 2004, the thing we were just talking about here.
You know something? If you had told us 1 year ago that we were going to come in third, we would have given anything for that. And you know something? Not only are we going to New Hampshire, Tom Harkin, we're going to South Carolina and Oklahoma and Arizona and North Dakota and New Mexico. We're going to California and Texas and New York. We're going to South Dakota and Oregon and Washington and Michigan. And then we're going to Washington, D.C. to take back the White House.
So there you go.
And then people are like, okay, he can't be president.
Yeah, people decide. So one of the things that rhetoricians might look at is, why did that noise become the evidence that this person cannot be president when he might have had really excellent ideas? But they're like, that noise discounted people. Discounted him in people's minds. It's an interesting thing. The same thing with, like, Jeb Bush with the please clap thing. That might be like, oh, he's too pathetic to be president or something. Who knows how people are going to read it. But these are the kind of things that interest rhetoricians. Not whether or not that's the truth or whether or not that's the thing that was actually communicated, but how do people perceive it? So perception, going all the way back to this question. Perception's huge. Perception's huge. And there's lots of different ways to access perception. So we have the first Kennedy-Nixon debate, and if you watch it, you start to look at it and say, oh, I can see why people who saw it on TV thought Kennedy won. But is that what you're seeing, or is that influenced by your knowledge of that research? Or the lack, your knowledge of that story? Because there isn't any really supporting research for that.
Do you think that's why like Ben Carson isn't like as like doing well in polls as he can be? Because like he's not really like as good a speaker as like the other candidates.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, there's being a good speaker is a double-edged sword. Like if somebody's a really good speaker, like really smooth, do you trust them? Like they're just like you're like cigarette and like lighter, like lozenge. You know, they're like all on the ball. Like they never stumble. They say everything exactly right. If somebody is super rehearsed, you trust them. Yeah.
I think it depends. I think if they're a good speaker, but they come across as being genuine, then they are trustworthy. But if they're good speakers, so that you can see that they're prepared, but they're puppeted, then I feel like it's very easy for the audience to see through that and not really trust that person.
Yeah.
So I feel like it depends so much on how they speak, how they convey themselves, how they carry themselves, and how they come across.
Yeah. But Ben Carson is speaking in a way that might not look good to us, but it could be interpreted as really genuine because he's not a politician, right? He's a surgeon. So of course he would be bad at, giving a shiny presentation, because he actually knows things, right? He's actually a doctor. He's actually smart, right? So there's that element to it as well. But yeah, I don't know why he's not doing so well, but he's got the advantage of, so if the gentleman in the back is right about pathos or emotion, feeling being the thing that politicians are going for is to get people whipped up, get people emotional about something. But Ben Carson has this ability of ethos. He's like, I'm a brain surgeon, which is about as high as you can get in terms of the perception of being really smart and really together. I'm a brain surgeon. And so if he stumbles or he talks or he doesn't know really, he blames the citizens of Pompeii for dying or whatever he said in the news. He's like, well, they were lazy. They were sitting around and the volcano ash rained down on them and they just couldn't move fast enough because they were like lazy or whatever. Like maybe he's not good at world history, but he can cut open your head and rewire you and then you're fine.
Does anybody know the famous surgery that Ben Carson was the first one to do? Yes.
He separated Siamese twins.
Yeah, that were connected at the head.
Mm.
Yeah.
Very difficult.
So it's not like a dummy. They don't say, "Oh, let's just get an old brain surgeon to do this." Right?
Yeah.
They find like the best one they can.
And it's also his ability to do that gives him credibility in venues that he might not be credible for, right? Like we all tend to think that it's okay for Michael Jordan to sell us batteries or underwear. But what does he really know about batteries or underwear? Isn't he really good at basketball? How does he really know what the finest underwear is? Or the finest battery, right? This kind of thing. Or like, famous quarterbacks. They try to sell you car insurance or lunch meat or things or sandwiches. And you're like, well, there's a spillover effect. And people have studied that too. It's like, why does that kind of excellence mean that they can be trusted in other things? That's the power of ethos, right? The other thing. So there's pathos and ethos, which is this. Ethos is usually thought of as credibility, but it can also be thought of as goodwill or good spirit or having your best interests at heart or being one of us, somebody who... You can translate ethos as home as well. Not house, but home in ancient Greek. So that gives you a little bit more of a sense to its meaning.
I have another interesting story about Ben Carson. So, my wife refuses to be associated with any political party. She thinks they're all terrible, right? She's super liberal. She's like, oh my God, we need to completely tear down the system and
I like this.
Go back to hunter-gathering days or something. I'm like, okay. And so, but she registered as like an independent because she's so liberal. She's not on any, but no one wants her, right, in their party. But if you register as independent, then all other people that are registered for independence for whatever reasons think, oh, they must support our idea. So we get a lot of Ben Carson literature sent to our house because they're like, oh, she's an independent, she might give money to Ben Carson. So I get all his stuff, and as a person that likes to study rhetoric and symbols and everything, I like to see what are they going for. Mm. And the most recent Ben Carson ad I got, I'll have to show it to you, Steve, because I'm like, I write back, great, this is interesting, keep it coming. You know, it's
oh man,
yeah, with sign her name, you know. And so, was a great picture of Ben Carson in his house, in front of this gigantic painting that he had commissioned of him. It's like he's in the front, then he has this gigantic, like 7-foot painting in his house of him with his arm around Jesus that he has in his house.
Now I know what painting I'm putting. I'm getting commissioned immediately.
Yeah. So I was like, okay, this makes me like nervous, right? Because every day you come home and you see a gigantic, not making fun of your religion or anything, or even making a comment on it, but even most Christians, even the most devout evangelical Christians, don't have a gigantic painting of them hugging Jesus when they walk in, right? Like, this is the first time I've heard of this. I don't think it's common. And I think they must think this is the way to get people's vote. And it just like showed me how different, like I perceive the world, than the audience that they're going after, or at the very least, what they think is persuasive. I did not think this is persuasive. I didn't think either like strong evangelical Christians would think this is persuasive. But they must think, aha, evidence that this is the person we need to vote for. And I'm like, wow, how wrong must I be about understanding the people that they're trying to persuade to vote for Ben Carson, right? Don't you think that's, I mean, what would you think? I don't care what your religious background is, but if you saw, fill in the blank, whatever religious thing, and there was like a painted, commissioned thing, I just thought, whoa, that changes my whole perception of what he's trying to do here. I mean, maybe I'm wrong, but do you think I'm wrong to be, like, shocked by that? Yes.
I'm actually from Kentucky, and
Yeah.
I lived in Tennessee for 4 years.
Yeah.
I'm not at all surprised by that.
Really? Like,
No.
if you went into someone's house and there was, like, a big painting with, like, Jesus holding the whole family, you'd be like, okay, just another one of those.
I would not be surprised.
Really? Okay. All right, that shows you how out of it I am. I never even thought that was a possibility. Well, that anybody would have this. Do you know?
I think it's
Very much a possibility.
yes.
Okay.
I grew up in Texas, and I knew lots of people who would get a birthday cake on Christmas for Jesus. Happy birthday, Jesus, and have like a birthday cake. Like it was very normal. So, I don't know. I mean, it's weird, right? Like, so the weirdest thing.
It's weird that I don't understand these people.
No, it's
the part that
the whole thing is weird. The whole thing, persuasion is a weird thing, and trying to convince other people is a weird thing. Primarily because what counts as evidence could be pretty much anything. Like the idea of reason and logic and thinking through things critically is a very new idea. It's only a few hundred years old, right? The Enlightenment, right? The age of reason, as they call it. All these standards for thinking objectively and thinking critically. It's all very new. It's like the little kid brother of all these other ways that people have had of solving things, which is, doubling down on how they feel, or consulting the gods, or just beating the crap out of someone until they stop talking, have been the ways that we've solved problems for thousands of years before this new Western sort of idea. But it's based on these ancient ideas that I'm going to get into in a minute. But we have to remember that reason is not a natural human ability. It's something we have to persuade each other to use. You have to be persuaded to use discussion and debate. The natural inclination is if somebody says something you think is stupid, to go hit them. Right? That's sort of the natural inclination. Or to just walk away from them, or stop talking, right? Or to think that they're incredibly stupid. But to actually open up your mind and say, well, let me think about what it is that you're saying, is kind of, that's a trained capacity. And that's something we don't think about. We think of logic and reason as natural human abilities. It's really nothing natural. If you're ever around a little kid, like I have a nephew who's 2 years old, reason and logic are not part of the game. Hitting you if you do something wrong is the way things are handled. Or biting you, right? Or throwing things that we don't want. Instead of saying, I don't want it, you pick it up and throw it across the room, right? And this is how we all are as kids.
Can I ask a question?
And then we're taught this sort of... so that's an important thing to think, too, is that meaning-making oftentimes will come from these more... come from other places, and then we rationalize it. We make it seem as if it was logical and reasonable that we got to that. So that's another thing rhetoricians are interested in, too, is how do people justify their beliefs? And how do they make it seem like what's temporally prior is logically prior, and vice versa. So something might be made to seem, well, logically, this is the connection we have to make before we get to this. But they might have done that. That was just the first thing that occurred to them. But then they justify it as a logical connection, and vice versa. They might say, well, to make this happen, we have to do this first and then do this. But it might be that it's a logical priority, but time is the thing that's more persuasive. So it's an interesting way to think about it. Did you want to say something?
Yeah, I was just going to ask a quick question. How many people here in their lives have bit somebody? A lot of people. All right. Okay.
Yeah. Little kids. We all suffered from that, but we got better. Right? We all are wonderful cases of being cured from childhood. I hope. I'm not a big kids guy. I'm always like, okay, that's great. Here, somebody, please, anybody, take it away.
When you said that, I had a famous flashback to when I was in preschool, and they had like a show and tell at my preschool, and I was going to blow everybody's socks off by bringing my tortoise. I had a tortoise, and so I brought this, like box tortoise, and tortoise just like stayed inside the shell and didn't do anything. It was really boring. But this other kid brought a duck, and the duck was like chasing kids around and doing all these things, and was way better than the tortoise. So I just got super jealous. I got like 100% unadulterated pure jealousy, and like it was too much for my little kid, immature self to handle. And so I went up to the kid that owned the duck, and I was like, "Your duck is bothering my tortoise." And it was like, the tortoise is like far away in its little shell. And so he's like, "What are you talking about?" And then I just bit him. And then we got in trouble because, he was crying and I was biting him. And the teacher's like, "You two stop fighting." And I'm like, "Yeah, stop fighting." And then I still remember that to this day, because it was like 100% jealousy, which is a very strong emotion, right? And my first reaction was just bite. And Steve is absolutely right. It's like, that's what you do when you're unsophisticated. But hopefully we evolve.
Well, you're taught, right? That's the thing. We tend to think reason. We tend to think about reason so much and logic so much. We think of them as natural, not something that people have to learn. And some people's education in that is not as good as others. There's a quality difference. So, and that's something that doesn't really get talked about in like presidential campaign season, which we're in now. People talk about sort of the absolute right thing and the absolute wrong thing, and this is the good direction and bad direction. We don't really think about how we've arrived at those conclusions, just what the policy should be, because it's right or because it's good. And the investigation doesn't get much more of that. So that's something that a lot of rhetoricians spend a lot of time studying. But there's a lot to look at. So I'll take you through a little bit of the history of rhetoric because it's interesting. I think you'll find it interesting how old it is and the different concerns. And then we'll talk a little bit about where rhetoric is today and the kind of things rhetoricians do a little bit. But keep your definition close in because you might find somebody who you really like who's sort of with you. So in ancient Athens, there were no
question.
Yeah.
Should we take a little break before you launch into this?
We
It's
can.
been about an hour.
Yeah. Do you guys want a break?
Use
you
the
wanna go-
bathroom, that sort of thing. Because this part of the lecture I've seen before, it's really interesting, and I want you to be fully awake. Right? Also, when I give the test, Penn asks a lot of questions for the section.
Good to know. I didn't know I featured so prominently in the test.
Yes, you do.
Oh, wow.
And that little vignette I told about the tortoise and the duck. That's also in there.
That happened yesterday, right? No, that was Friday. So how long of a break do you think we have?
Like, how about come back and... No one's ever heard of this before? They give a tour of the insane asylum part of Willard once a year. Every year it's worth going to. And like I said, it's not very far from here. It's a weird little town.
Let's go after class.
Yeah, okay. Yeah.
Everybody who has a big car.
It's really open, but I happen to have some keys. The interesting thing about it is, it's on a site that could have been Cornell. Like, it's a beautiful site. It overlooks the lake. Everybody that lives in this little town that's right outside the gate works there. Like, after generations. It's not that big of a town. There's no other work around there. So, it's called Willard. It's worth looking up.
Like Willard Strait?
Yeah. It's not named after the same person, but Willard. It's like one of the oldest psychiatric centers in New York City. It's closed now. It's a mere drug treatment center.
Okay, well, welcome back. Now we'll get into some rhetoric definitions, a little bit of rhetoric history in this part of the talk. And I hope it won't be boring. The first place we're going to look is ancient Athens. And there's a few things you need to know about ancient Athens. I talked a little bit about it. They thought it was fine to have slaves. Women had no status whatsoever, except as sort of incubators, I guess. They'd be about as high as you go. I'll tell you a little bit more about that in a second. But then they also didn't have the professional classes like we would think you'd have. They didn't have professional teachers or professional attorneys or politicians, things like that. What they had was people who would say they could teach you these things, and you would go and make arrangements with them. So if you were accused of a crime, there was no attorney to defend you. You had to defend yourself. But you could go hire somebody to write your defense speech for you. And these people were called... it's really nice to work at a university where they provide chalk. My university doesn't provide... There's no chalk anywhere. You have to bring your own. Isn't that fantastic? I'm glad I'm taping this, but no one will see this till after Wednesday, so I'll be fine. So it's nice to be in a place that provides chalk.
What if it's delayed by a snowstorm for a week?
Oh, no, it would no. They don't delay things like that. They don't delay things like this. So they had these people who you could hire to write your defense speech for you or to teach you how to be a big bad politician. Like Jeb Bush could use some help from these people. These people were called the sophists. You might recognize this from your philosophy class, or if you've ever read anything by Plato, as the bad guys of philosophy. Right? The guys who trick and disregard truth and all this kind of thing. The enemies of the Platonists, of Socrates and Plato. So the sophists were very, very complex philosophical thinkers, we're starting to learn. A lot of their work doesn't survive, but what they saw the world as was sort of this sort of fluid and dynamic, human-oriented world. So unlike our world today, where you feel like humans are a part of a world that's governed by genetics or biology or physics, whatever you want to put in charge, the sophists said it was sort of a human-governed world. One of the famous sophists was Protagoras, and his famous thing was, man is the measure of all things. They'd say, well, what do you mean by that? So, well, if I go outside and say to you it's cold, it might not be cold to you. You might say, well, it's not that cold, and we could argue about it. But people are the measuring stick. We create the measuring sticks, and then we pretend like they're not us. Like a meter. A meter was created by somebody. You probably know who. I'm not as smart as you guys. But the meter was created by somebody, and then we act like it's an external measurement. Right? It's like 1/10 of 1/1000th of the circumference, whatever the standard is. We create those things. And the sophists sort of had this idea. This was probably one of the most famous sophists was a man named Gorgias. And he was like the super famous like Elvis or Jay-Z or somebody like this. To where people would pay a lot of money to go and hear him read poetry. He'd read this rhythmic poetry and somebody might play a lyre and then people would be like, yeah, like a hip-hop concert, the same kind of thing. So it would be a lot of money to hear him recite the birds or something. So Gorgias was not Greek. The thing about the sophists is they were all foreigners, they were all very wealthy, and they were all very, very interested in language and meaning. That's the thing that united them all. None of them were Athenian, hardly any of them. And they all came to Athens and said, hey, I can make a lot of money here, helping people out with this weird society where there's no school to go to, but people need to learn things. So I'll teach you how to be a good citizen, or I'll teach you how to speak and make a good speech, or I'll help you with your legal defense. And, Gorgias was Italian. He came from Syracuse, not the one next door, the Italian one. And he went there as a diplomat, and he's like, wow, I can make a lot of money here. I speak Greek, and he did. He became incredibly famous. And Plato hated him so much, he wrote a book called Gorgias, where he makes fun of him and critiques him and points out that he really doesn't teach anything at all. And this is the beginning of the distrust of rhetoric, is with Gorgias. But this is what Gorgias said. This comes from a famous speech Gorgias wrote called Encomium to Helen. Does anybody know who Helen was? In Greek mythology? Not a goddess, but maybe the goddess by modern vernacular. Like, oh my God, she's a goddess. Yeah.
She was, I don't remember if she was Greek, but she was married, or getting married, or married to Agamemnon. So what's his brother's name?
Yep, his brother Menelaus.
Yep. And then got stolen by the Prince of Troy, Paris.
Got stolen. Actually, this is a funny little side story. Got stolen by Paris. That's a good interpretation. When you look to the Greek, you find... I don't know if you guys can see the board. If I'm trying
I'll turn the line on.
Writing up here. The Greek word of what happened to Helen is the Greek word plagiro. Does that look like an English word that we use? Plagiro. It's a good college student word. Plagiarism. What does plagiarism mean?
Stolen work.
Yeah, stolen ideas. Yeah. Stolen work. Or like not giving credit to taking somebody else's work and not giving credit. So plagiro in ancient Greek means to kidnap, or it can also be frustratingly translated to seduce. Which shows you a little bit about the value of women in the ancient Greek world, right? You either like literally stole her, or you like convinced her to steal away with you. We even kind of still use that in English, like they stole her away, right?
What was Gorgias again?
Gorgias was a sophist, probably the most famous sophist. This is a quote by him. So, Helen was thought of as, of course, being at fault for this by most of the Greek world, because as a weak woman, she's going to resist Paris. But Paris is described as being hot, right? I don't know if you read the Iliad, but he's described as being beautiful, right? He's like amazing looking. And so she's like, okay, you're better than my nasty looking, dude I'm supposed to marry for political reasons. So she goes to Troy and starts like a 14-year war, because they all go to fight. Menelaus gets his friends together, and they all go to get her back. So it's like this guy gets his bros together, and they go to the other dude's house to get the girl back. It's like very typical kind of story. And it becomes such an intense war. The gods get involved, and they come down and kill a few people, and they're like, man, that was fun. And they go back to Olympus. Like, nobody even saw we were there. It's like, it's fun to get your hands dirty once in a while. Why let Zeus have all the fun, right? We'll jump down there, too. So, an encomium is a speech of high praise that you'd only give to somebody who was a devoted public servant or somebody who did good for the city. So he did an encomium for Helen. What do you think was the reaction to this? It's like you going here and saying Hitler wasn't so bad. Positive views of Hitler, right? Like Helen is seen as this horrible, horrible person. Like nobody's naming their kid Helen, right? She's seen as like the worst of what women bring to society. Right? So Gorgias is like, my next big composition, my next album I'm going to drop. The street date is coming. It's encomium to Helen. People are like, what? How could you possibly find anything beneficial out of her? So he praises her. He talks about how he shouldn't blame her, how she's actually not at fault. You can go read it. The whole text of it survives. You can Google it and read it. It's fantastic. But then at the end of it, he's like, by the way, I don't believe anything that I just said. Why did I do this? Why did I do this? He says, well, I wanted to see if I could. And then he has this quote, which is his understanding of rhetoric. He also said that speech or rhetoric was a pharmakon, another great Greek word, that we have an English connection to. Like pharmakon, what English word looks like that? Pharmacy. So pharmakon is a...
Pharmacy?
Well, not a pharmacy. What do you think the Greek word is? They didn't have pharmacies. They didn't have pharmacists. People, you go pay the person who knew something about plants and be like, oh yeah, I didn't chew on that. Well, like a pharmakon is a medicine or a drug. And he says, speech is a pharmakon. He says that too. So it's either a drug or a medicine. Big difference, yeah? Or maybe not. A lot of people abuse drugs that make people better in order to get high or to get particular effects from it that aren't necessarily good, right? But the whole thing is it changes you. Wouldn't that be what we say about a drug? It changes you in some way. And if you misuse it, it can be damaging or it can be bad or it can be unhealthy or unethical to use it that way. So this is the very first definition of rhetoric. It's the definition of rhetoric that Plato and Socrates take on. And Plato spends almost his whole life writing against the sophists. Every Plato dialogue he read has been a critique of the sophists, of a sophist. The sophist appears in it. They tangle with Socrates. They lose. They run off. This kind of thing. But modern scholars and ancient rhetoricians, people who do the history of rhetoric, have recovered sort of the view of the sophists this way and looked at them. But Gorgias was very famous for this definition of it of it's a drug. It's something that can change people. Something we can use medicinally, but at the same time we can use it in a bad way. And in Gorgias, Plato critiques him a couple of different ways. He says, if you were a teacher of martial arts, boxing, or maybe today we'd say karate or something, and your student kills somebody with their skills that you taught them, shouldn't you feel responsible for that? They get into a bar fight, they use their karate, they kill somebody. Aren't you responsible for that? Don't you have some blame? Likewise, when you teach someone how to speak well, and then they convince the entire city that we should spend public money on this thing that only benefits a few people, aren't you responsible for that? Don't you have some blame? And in the dialogue, Gorgias says, well, the ethics, that's something else. It's not really what I teach. But nobody would really do that. He's like, oh. So he says, what if... so in ancient Athens, they had socialized medicine. It wasn't single payer. It was like they would just take the tax money and hire a doctor, and everybody could just go see the doctor. So he said, what if Athens was looking for a doctor, and we had two candidates, and one was trained by you, and one was trained by a doctor? Who would we hire? Because they come before and speak about their medical prowess and how good they were. Who would they hire? The person trained by you, Gorgias, or the person trained by a doctor? And Gorgias said, well, they would probably be persuaded by my student. And Socrates says, well, that's a problem. Because what you provide is something that looks good and tastes good, but isn't necessarily really good. And Gorgias' response to this whole dialogue was to say it was really funny. He's like, it's a nice little bit of satire or something. But he said all of these judgments are done through words, and words shape the way people think, and you can't really escape from that. You can pretend it's not that way, but you can't escape the power of words. So why not teach people how to use them and live with those consequences instead of telling people that they can avoid being influenced by persuasive words through some other thing like truth or ontological knowledge or philosophy or whatever your alternative is, Socrates. That's a worse world to say, well, the words will never hurt us if we just don't believe in them. So you're going to have a world where people don't have those defensive skills or not. And that was Gorgias's sort of contribution. So the sophists versus the Platonists, that was the ancient Greek world up until Aristotle came along. And Aristotle said, well, instead of a world where we either choose rhetoric or we choose philosophy, why don't we have rhetoric for particular circumstances? And he wrote his book, Rhetoric, to talk about how when there's limited time and limited resources to fix the problem, we need rhetoric to persuade people. We can't enjoy the luxury of philosophy to find the truth. We have to do our best with the unknowns. So he identified rhetoric as the art of identifying all available means of persuasion in a given instance. And one of the things to note about this is he says, he doesn't say the art of rhetoric is to find the one that convinces the audience absolutely and roll with it. But to identify all the available means is the art of rhetoric. So that makes it sort of interesting. Aristotle was very famous for lots of reasons. He's the person who, we talked about pathos and ethos earlier, and logos. He's the one who identified those things as modes of proof that people create. The speaker creates out of words. So he gave some attention to the sophists. At the same time, he gave some credit to philosophy, saying there's certain things that maybe in rhetoric, when we say rhetoric, that it's not necessarily the preferred method of philosophy. Dialectic is the preferred method of philosophy, which is where you and I sit down and we agree to talk about something like, what does it mean for something to be really beautiful? And then we say, I'm not going to accept anything you say until I'm absolutely satisfied I understand it. You'll do the same for me. And it takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of patience. And when the Persians are coming, we don't have this luxury, right? We have to figure out how many soldiers should we recruit? How many boats do we need to get ready? What should be the battle strategy? What should be this sort of thing? So this is why Plato is thought of as sort of an anti-democratic thinker. A lot of people identify him that way, along with Thucydides and some other Greeks, as people who were critics of democracy. And they thought it was too slow, too cumbersome, made bad decisions. But Aristotle worked for a monarchy for a lot of his career, too. He's a teacher. He was a teacher to a very famous person. Does anybody know who that was? Yeah.
Alexander the Great.
Yeah, Alexander the Great. So yeah, King Philip of Macedon hired him to educate my son. And so a lot of people attribute Aristotle's views on rhetoric to why Alexander was such a good leader and how convincing he was. When he conquered some group of people, he would show up and he'd wear their formal attire, not his own attire. And he would go to he's like, where's your temple? How do you guys worship your gods? Can I participate? And then they'd be like, whoa, this is not what we expected conquering to be like. The last time we got conquered, everybody's heads were chopped off. And Alexander the Great's like, no, I want you to be part of this. I want to be part of your life. You can be part of my life. And the subscription, the low price of only half of all of your income of the entire city every year, you can be under my jurisdiction, and we won't burn your city to the ground. So, okay, great. But the big critique of democracy that was floating around at this time was the Athenians were a huge hegemonic power, like the United States. They had an amazing navy, and what they would do is go around and they kind of had a protection racket. You know, sort of like in these movies where like the guy opens up the shop and then these gangster guys come in and they're like, oh, it's such a nice shop. It'd be a shame if something happened to it. You know, there's these bad guys around, but we can protect you. You know, just give us like $10,000 a month. We'll protect you from all those bad gangs. You'd be like, go screw yourself. I'm not giving you all this money a month. And then that night, people throw bricks through the windows of your store and mess it up. And then a couple days later, this guy's come and says, oh, what a mess. It's a shame that happened. Too bad you weren't being protected by us. Right? Same thing the Athenians are doing, right? So they'd go around to all these different islands and all these little city-states and say, we'll protect you from the big bad Persians. You just give us hospitality money, right? That's the Roman word for it, hospitality. The payment that you would give for protection, or the racket. So there was one island that refused to pay. They'd been for a long, long time, and they're like, we're not paying for this. This is stupid. So then the Athenians got together and it's like, we should send the fleet there to teach them a lesson. Like, what should we do? Should we kill all the men, and we'll take all the women and children and sell them as slaves? All right. Everybody in favor? Aye. Right? So they vote, and they send the ships on their way. And the next morning they wake up and they were like, that was a little harsh. Man, what were we on? We were like controlled by anger. And they were like, do we really regret this? Let's send their last boat to send a message that says, don't do the thing that we told you to do to the general. And then they just waited to see who would get there first. And when the other boat got there, it was like, oh, we know that we're getting close because we can see the smoke. So they were too late. So this was the big critique of it, is that democratic groups of people are fickle. They rule by populist ideas. They rule by tyranny majority. They make huge mistakes. And if you had a wise philosophical leader, these things wouldn't happen. Well, Aristotle was a lot more moderate than the Platonic critique of that stuff and said, if people are trained better in rhetoric, they can find all available means of persuasion, make sure good decisions are being made. So that was his contribution to the history of rhetoric. Now we move forward to the Romans. Roman society is a little bit different than Greek society. Well, a lot different than Greek society in a lot of ways. But there are two important definitions of rhetoric that we get out of Roman life. The first person is Cicero. That's what he looked like. Cicero was incredibly... Does anybody know anything about Cicero? Yeah.
He was a senator and advisor of the emperors through Pax Romana, but then I think pissed off Kaluga or some emperor, and they exiled him to an island.
Yeah, they cut his head off.
Oh. Okay.
Yeah,
No.
and they put it on a
Serious
stick.
exile.
Yeah, like, we're going to exile your head from your body, and your soul from your body. They cut his head off, and they stuck it on a pike outside the Senate, and they put nails through his tongue. They pulled his tongue out, nails through his tongue. So this is kind of a good symbol, talking about your definition of rhetoric. Persuasive symbol of, like, what happens if you speak out against the state. But what's interesting about Cicero, lots of interesting things about Cicero, but he was an attorney, and a lot of his work was with sort of this legal system that's very different than the Greeks, where they had professional attorneys who would try to convince groups of people or judges that their client was innocent and things like that. So he's written a lot about that. You can go read his work. He mostly talks about interesting cases and how to figure out how to defend somebody. Very interesting stuff. And then he became a politician. And he was really, really good friends with Julius Caesar. They were very good friends. They grew up together, same generation. But they had very different views on how to run government. And, Cicero was really shocked at his assassination, very surprised by it. He didn't think of him as a tyrant like that. But then as things went on later, he became an important symbol of the Republic as opposed to the Empire, which is a very different sort of thing than what he was for. But when he was very young, he wrote a book about oratory called On Invention, where he talked about how to put a speech together. It's really interesting, really cool. But then he didn't like that. He's like, I wrote that when I was 19. I really didn't know what I was doing. And then later in life, he wrote The Orator, which is a 3-volume book. And it's really, really cool, where he imagines these people talking about what makes someone a good speaker. And he had a very pragmatic view of rhetoric, speech designed to persuade. So that's different from Aristotle, isn't it? And it's different from Gorgias. What you can see here is a trajectory of sort of separating it and making rhetoric more what we think of it today, a tool. A tool. Very much like how we think of language as a tool, and not some other definition of language like I can really sort of like make you think, a symbiote. What if we thought of language as a symbiote? You know what a symbiotic organism is? And that changes things quite a bit. Right? So who's the anemone and who's the client? Look, my favorite understanding of rhetoric I like, if we have time, is I like these videos of these crocodiles. And they sit with their mouth open, and these little birds like hop around and clean the teeth. And I'm just like, so which one is language and which one is people? Think about that. So if we change that definition, that really rocks things. We can make the relationship anything we want. That's the beauty of theory. Theory is about exploring relationships and then saying, what's the resulting politics if this were true? So when people say, global warming is just a theory, the retort is, well, yeah, it's a theory. It's a theory of relationships that then gives us a pathway to walk if we so choose to do it, if the theory is convincing. Not necessarily like it would be the endpoint. So if somebody has a theory on something, that's like a good starting point to say, well, what would the world look like if we believe this thing to be true? If we could test it and see if it were true, what would be the politics that we would get?
One of my favorite stories about Cicero, I studied Latin, and in Latin you say his name Cicero.
Yeah, that's
C's
right.
The C's are hard, so you say Cicero. And it's interesting, there was in the 1940s and 50s and 60s, the chairman of the English department and also the Cornell historian was a guy named Morris Bishop. And Cornell is the only university that doesn't have a Latin motto. Does anybody know what our motto is? The motto of the university is,
I will found an institution where any person can pursue and study.
Yeah, it's the only Ivy League school without we have an English one. Every other Ivy League school has a Latin one. But Morris Bishop wanted to change it and make it into a Latin motto. And he would always say, I want to make it, this quote from Cicero, Vita est supplicum. Anybody know what that means? Life is punishment. And he did it jokingly, right?
I've been in some classes like that.
Wouldn't that be an appropriate motto for Cornell?
Yeah. Yeah, Cicero's very influential in the founding fathers of this country. But they called him Tully. I don't really know why. Marcus Turilius Cicero. But they'd say, old Tully has it right. Because the founders of this country they were afraid of democracy. They preferred the model of a republic. And Cicero is one of the early Republican thinkers. Not like Jeb Bush, but little R Republican. Yeah.
You're saying Cicero, founding fathers relied more on Stoic philosophy than enlightened liberalism.
Yeah, I'm not necessarily Stoicism. I don't know if Cicero would be counted as a Stoic, you see. But he's definitely someone thinking about what does it mean to have a republic, and what's the value of a republic? What does it mean to have this thing that we care for? So, like, as opposed to Athenian democracy, which is maybe even an oligarchy, but everybody decides on everything, you would have these representative people deciding on the stuff, and then everybody else is doing other stuff. And so they relied on that quite a bit. In fact, I think it was John Adams gave a number of talks. Well, I don't remember who it was. The rhetoric talks that he gave at Harvard.
It was Adams.
Yeah, Adams' talks at Harvard rely on Cicero quite a bit for understanding what rhetoric is and why it's important to a republic. And that's an important connection they make there. So for me, this is like the twist where rhetoric becomes more of a tool and less some other kind of, not tool like, oh my God, that guy's such a tool. Like a tool like a hammer. As opposed to some other relationship we could have with rhetoric as either a co-conspirator, as a living thing, or something that's like an organ of the body, maybe like a spleen or a liver, depending on how important you think rhetoric is to you. Tonsils.
To answer your question, the founding fathers weren't like uniform.
Oh, well, that's true too.
They all believe different philosophers.
Yeah. They all do mention Tully, though. Almost everybody talks about him in some way because they're interested in this project of republicanism, civic republicanism. What is that? And this was sort of a new-ish idea. to them. So they were looking at these ancient thinkers as a way of doing that. So I think they were pretty heavily influenced by him, but I don't know how far that goes. But definitely in terms of what speechcraft looks like and what persuasion looks like, I think it's pretty influential. Then time goes on, we have Quintilian, who looks a little bit like a hipster. I couldn't really find a great... He's looking pretty Williamsburg here. Ready to go to the coolest new bar and drink a $7 PBR. He's ready to go. So Quintilian was later... So I contrast these because this is like Republican Rome, and this would be the heart of like Imperial Rome and Imperial Rome near the end. And Quintilian was a foreigner too. He was a Spaniard. He was from Spain. This is when Roman influences... You've all seen Gladiator, right? This is when Roman influence is very, very, very far extended. And so Quintilian was a Spanish guy, and he was a teacher, and he moved to Rome and to Italy, and was like, wow, this is cool. And then the emperor, at the time, Emperor Vespasian, was like, what we need is a Senate back. We're losing our values. We're losing good Roman values. We need to have a Senate back, so we need to have a program of teaching people how to be good speakers. We wouldn't have these problems today with crime and with trouble in our society if we just had good orators and if we had good orators and we had a good speaking curriculum, we'd be great. So I have the grants for that. And Quintilian got one of these grants and wrote a 14-volume set of books on rhetoric called The Institutes of Oratory. And it's basically how to raise your kid. It's like one of these weird things where people are like, I'm going to make my kid like a football star, or like Venus and Serena Williams, their dad is like, I'm going to make them tennis stars. And he was like, if you want to make your kid a politician, I got the plan. So from birth, here's how to do it to make them an amazing speaker. And in it, he talks about all kinds of stuff that we talked about, like the importance of pronouncing words correctly and incorrectly in different audiences, the importance of how to carry yourself walking. He's like, whenever you speak in front of foreign audiences, you want to speak Latin to where it doesn't take much imagination for them to imagine that there's a Roman legion of soldiers behind you. Whoa! But you think about like what Jeb Bush was trying to do, right? It's very Quintilian. Like to talk about, I will use the might of the United States to push these people into supplication. And I mean, it's comic when they do it, but you can imagine someone doing it in a way to where you're like, yeah, I can see all of our aircraft carriers and jets coming to your door kind of thing. If they did it in a good way. And that's what Quintilian talked about. But this idea of a good man speaking well, sort of Quintilian. So now we're getting into the ethical, which is something that's still with us, this ethical idea of there's something about someone's goodness or badness in their speech. There's some connection. Or there's something about their ethics in their speech. And that's something to think about too, is like when Hillary Clinton talks, I have friends who are like, gosh, I can't even stand to hear her. Because she's just so nasty. And I'm like, what do you mean by so nasty? It's like, oh, she's just so fake, and such a liar, and such a manipulator, and she's so dirty, and it's just funny to me that all of that can be communicated by her just saying like one line on CNN. All of that, I mean, that's an incredibly well-packed sentence for all that to come with it, right? Or the same thing with Barack Obama. Like my stepmom's just like, can't even stand to listen to that a-hole talk. But she hates him, thinks he's like a liar, and what about Benghazi? Right? That's what her retort for everything. Like some people say, thanks, Obama. And she's like, we'll never know what happened to Benghazi. I'm like, really? They had like 18 hours of hearings about this where everyone kind of said the same thing. And you don't think that, well anyway. I mean, but that's what she's convinced of, right? These people are manipulating, and you can hear it in their speech. So for Quintilian, that's the idea of a good Roman man. And that's connected with all kinds of ideas about the performance of masculinity, the performance of one's gender in a correct way is tied up in all that. And he has things about you don't want to speak too femininely kind of stuff is in there too. So that's really, really weird to look at from our point of view. But also it's interesting to look at that they were thinking about this. We think about gender performance as like cutting-edge sociology or cutting-edge anthropology. You can take classes in gender studies. But here's Quintilian writing about it. He's like, audiences will read a feminine performance in a different way they will a masculine one. So you need to be aware of what audiences think a masculine Roman man looks like and acts like and walks like. And it's like, wow, that's pretty old stuff. And is he suggesting that genders are performed? That's pretty cutting edge for somebody living in the Roman Empire. Right? Something to look at. Something interesting to look at.
By the way.
Yep. I love this picture.
When we have a jury go and, hear a case, do you think people use those same ways to determine whether or not someone's innocent or guilty? Not about what they said, but like how they said it. Isn't that weird? I mean, can you tell whether or not someone's lying by the way they talk? Can you? Like, you know certain people, like, you know immediately when they're lying by the way that they all of a sudden talk a certain way and stuff. Yeah.
Change stuff in body language?
Well, that's part of the rhetoric, right?
Yeah, that's a big part of it. The phatic, right? Like things like touching is communication. Like, sometimes you'll be in really bad shape and somebody you care about puts their hand on your shoulder, and it just means, we say that meant a lot. Or like your presence there meant a lot. You didn't have to say anything. That's interesting too. Is that rhetorical? Some people say yes, some people say no. But body language is really interesting. One of the things about body language that is fascinating to me is that the signs of what we culturally think of as the signs of misrepresentation, manipulation, and lying are also the same things we do when we're nervous. Biting our nails, looking around, shifty. Be like, oh, they're trying to trick me. But they also might just be nervous. So that's a weird thing to think about too. Yeah.
I think it was like a TED Talk or some podcast I listened to about like why people lie and then like talking about lying spotters, and they brought up specifically Bill Clinton's like the country, and he said like I did not have sexual relations with that woman. Like lie spotters are people that study why people lie immediately were able to tell that that's just like that's not how you speak normally, and the way he gave that sentence immediately told that he was like lying. So
yeah. There's a professor here. He used to be in the Department of Communication. Now he's in the law school. His name's Jeff Hancock. Does anybody know him? He's an expert on lying. He's also employed not only by Cornell, but also Homeland Security. And this is what he does. He teaches people the psychology of lying.
You're lying.
I'm not lying. And the interesting thing that his specialty is, this is why he used to be in the Department of Communication, he can tell when people are lying online. Like, in chat groups and stuff like that. Like, have you ever heard of this phrase, catfishing? Yeah. So what he does for Homeland Security is he teaches people that work for Homeland Security how to, when they read people's emails, are they really doing this sort of thing? Is this real? Are they trying to mislead us? Are they doing fake emails? Is this a serious threat? That sort of thing. It's an interesting job, isn't it? He's a very... I might ask him to come speak to class sometime. He's got a lot of interesting data. Like I said, he moved from the communication school to the law school. I don't know how the hell he did this, but they're like, yeah, we need you in the law school. Right? So I think what they did, he has a Ph.D., he's not a law background, but I think they might be interested in the law school in teaching people that are going to be lawyers about some of these same sort of things and in understanding lying and that sort of thing.
Well, most attorneys never go to trial these days. They'll never go to trial. They'll never do a jury. They'll never do jury selection. But one thing all attorneys will do is take a deposition.
Yeah.
And that might be where his skills would be.
Oh, yeah, probably.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Deposition's really good. But the idea of like being able to find somebody on the stand in cross-examination, that's like movie stuff. But voir dire is a good one, too. Voir dire is good. But in voir dire, you're really not looking for somebody lying. You're just looking for someone's capability of, can they follow the law?
Voir dire is when you're asking the jury and trying to figure out if they should be on the jury.
Yeah.
You're selecting a jury.
I was on one jury in my life, and then after it was over, the attorneys asked me what I did because I talked about our reasoning and what we decided to do. And they're like, what do you do? And I was like, I teach debate and rhetoric. And they were like, the attorneys looked at each other like, you should never be on a jury. And you should tell the lawyers exactly this when you're in the jury pool. And to this day, it has worked. Like, there's the magic words. They're like, what do you teach? I was like, I teach argumentation, debate, critical thought, public speaking, and things like that. And they're like, okay, well, you can go home. One attorney, he was like, oh, you teach debate and argument and speech. Oh, well, there's a lot of advocacy in the law. And I was like, could you tell me what part isn't advocacy? And there was like a little giggle from everybody else in the room. He's like, well, burden of proof. And then he talked for like 20 minutes about burden of proof. And he was like, what do you think about that, professor? And I was like, that's not how I teach it. And then I stood up and gave my own version. And then they asked me to go home.
And never come back.
Yeah.
So a lot of people don't realize this. Shakespeare said all the world's a stage.
Yeah.
What he really meant was like, people are always watching you, right? So like, when I was in law school, I found this guy. I tried to find like the best attorney in the town. I asked all the professors. They're like, "It's this guy," and I'm like, went to work for him because I wanted to find out like his tricks, right? And find out.
And also that Shakespearean idea, all the world's a stage, means that everything's a performance.
Yeah.
So are people laying bare their soul when they talk to you and confess and talk, or are they performing in the way that they think communicates honesty? The difference is huge. Like the idea that we live in a world where we have no direct access to each other's minds is terrifying, but also very liberating. And the fact that everything, including this right now, that you're witnessing is a performance. And we're always performing what we want others to see us as, but we're doing it in a way based on cultural and social cues about what that looks like. So that's a really interesting way to think about it. So when someone's honest with you, it doesn't mean that they're no longer honest with you. It's that they're performing honesty. And it tells you a lot about, you think about that and you'd be like, why was I so moved by that? Even though I know that that was not true. And it was against my good interest to agree with that person. Why was I pulled to do it? And this is where rhetoric becomes like the Force. You've seen the recent movie. Like Kylo Ren can just hold people still. I think that's really cool. And I was like, you know what? That's the power of rhetoric, too. You don't have to be an angry emo guy. Like, Hot Topic shopper or whatever his problem is. To do that. Captivating words can hold people like that and can get people to reveal things they'd rather not reveal.
Yeah.
But through that process is double-sided. You can get things revealed about yourself through engaging in rhetoric too. You have to be careful. But it is like that Jedi kind of thing. And a lot of times I feel that way. Because I see these things, I'm like, wow, I've seen rhetoric do those same things. It's really interesting to me to make that kind of comparison.
Yeah.
So this is like sort of like people who do rhetoric as spirituality or rhetoric as belief system kind of stuff, which we'll get into with Christianity.
Just a couple quick things. One was when I went to go work for this lawyer, I was like, what are your tricks? Not so directly, but basically I was asking him. And he had two. He said, in voir dire, when you're asking, you're dealing with a lot more people because some of those people are going to make the jury. But he goes, that's when you win the trial.
Yeah.
And I was like, how? And he's like, you show people you're friendly, right? And even you want them to like you. And so you ask these loaded questions like, if someone was mistreated, it's in communication theory, it's called inoculation theory. You tell them the worst thing that your client has done, and then you try to make an argument without making it seem like you're making an argument that that's okay. If somebody had a relationship and they didn't know that the other person was underage, right? But there's no specific law against this, it's more a judgment thing. You would follow the law and find them innocent, right? There was reasonable doubt. Yes, could you do that or not? And then they're like, yes. Yes. Because you're making your argument, but you're setting it up so you're getting them to come to a lot of agreements. Even if you're not asking the person that you're going to select for the jury, you're still in front of that stage. So that's when you're winning your case. When they don't even know you're trying to persuade them. They're just sitting there hanging out waiting for their turn to ask questions. Be asked questions. And then the second thing he said was the most important thing. No matter how despicable, because this is a defense attorney, how despicable your client is, at some point during the trial, when somebody says something really mean about your client, you have to look over at them and put your arm around them and comfort them. Because then that shows that you have empathy for them. And what you're telling the audience is, without saying a word, well, their thing is, my client's being picked on, and I feel bad for him, and you should too. Right? And then, without saying a word, you're saying that. And he said, those are a good reason why I win a lot more cases than all the other attorneys that never do these very simple things.
And Cicero said the same thing in his legal advice. He said, 2 emotions at the end of the trial: indignation and pity. That's what you want the jury to feel. So what's indignation?
Anger.
An indignant person, yeah.
Isn't it someone poor?
No, that's indigent.
Indigent, yeah.
It's a different word.
Pissed off, right?
Yeah, but what are they pissed off about?
Just the fact, I guess, I don't know what the context Cicero was bringing it up in,
Yeah.
but
It's like
pissed off.
People who are these ridiculous people are like Wendy's or something. I'm like, I can't believe I had to wait 30
Right.
minutes to get my Baconator.
You probably go for this kind of deal.
Yeah, it's like, I can't believe I have to put up with this. This is totally unsatisfactory. This is just not permissible. Like, indignant. It's like, I can't believe these charges were even brought up against this person. What a waste of the taxpayer money. What a waste of the court's time. And then pity is like, look at the life this person had. We should be grateful they haven't murdered everyone. We're stolen from everyone, right? You had a question in the back?
Oh no, I was just gonna say, there's this like new Netflix series called Jinx, and like about this guy who basically is accused of murdering like multiple people, and I mean they even had that he.
Oh, I've heard about this. Yeah, the old guy.
Yeah. I don't want to give away, but like he basically admitted to cutting up the body, killing someone, cutting up the body. But the jury, when he was giving his testimony, when they interviewed the people after, they just said he seemed just so harmless. He just didn't seem like he could do it. Even though he said he did it, and then he said one part, and the jury laughed, and the prosecutor was like, "We've lost the case."
Yeah.
Like right when they heard the jury laugh, they're like they sympathized with him. They see him as human. We couldn't portray him as a monster, and they lost. They felt like they lost.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, a famous scholar, a famous philosopher, somebody who studied language stuff, Jacques Derrida, maybe somebody who encountered philosophy who was important for talking about semiotics and meaning theory. He's not a rhetorician, but he's in rhetoric. Said, lies are not self-effacing in the light of the truth. I think that speaks to what you're talking about. Lies are not self-effacing in the light of the truth. It's like we have this image that when the truth comes out, it's like, no, the light, and it burns up all the little demons, little shadow demons, lies. It's like very sort of naive, childlike sort of thing. But often the truth will shine the same as the lies, then maybe not even as bright. You're like, So it's like, that kind of thing, it's like the cultural context or the believability. Even if someone's telling the truth, everybody will sort of laugh at them and be like, oh, you couldn't possibly, because of that cultural pressure. And there's a great novel that demonstrates this. So Bret Easton Ellis, who's a fiction writer, wrote this novel, America. And it was a movie with Christian Bale in it not too long ago. And the movie treated it more as like a comedy. I don't know if you watched it. It was like almost comic, right? In the novel, you get this sense where when you read it, you're like, did he actually, you start to disbelieve Patrick. Like, did he actually do these things? Because nobody believes him. I mean, he's like super confused. He has a shootout with the police, blows up a police car, running through Manhattan, and then it's like, he calls his attorney in the middle of the night. It's like, I did all this, and here's where the bodies are. And then his attorney sees him at the bar a couple weeks later and was like, that was hilarious. That was so funny, what you left on my answering machine. So it's like this idea, this very same idea of like the cultural and social environment is such that it creates the conditions under which truth could form. And that's sort of an idea from a modern philosopher, Michel Foucault. The idea that truth arises when the cultural conditions for its recognition appear, not when it appears. So if you look at the history of knowledge, we move from natural science to biology. Right? We move to economics from whatever it was, whatever that weird French word is for that. Or we move to the study of meaning and language from grammar. So what counted as knowledge and truth at Cornell like 100 years ago, it's just laughable today. Like you go and look at old books, they wouldn't make sense to you. Old science books, they're just like listing the parts of the duck. And that was as far as biology went. They're like, they didn't tell anything about its habits or where it lives or what it eats or what it likes to do or the noises it makes. That's all sort of modern. And it's like they would just sort of like break it apart into its parts, and that was what science was. And so the conditions of which a truth is a fungible thing. And that's really interesting to look at, too, is the idea that the truth doesn't say truth. It's culturally conditioned moments allow for its recognition, for its emergence as a political category. And he wrote about sexuality, mental illness, medicine, all this stuff. Yeah, right. The prison and how these things became what they were.
Very interesting.
But we're pretty far ahead of where we are now.
Yeah.
He's like writing in the 1960s and 70s, but we'll get there.
But since you brought up Foucault, I was just going to say he spent some time at Cornell.
Oh yeah.
Anybody here ever hear of the Telluride House? So if you ever go to the Telluride House and they give you a tour, they'll be like, this is the spot where Foucault came and he was caught masturbating on the front porch by campus security. And they were like, was this French guy masturbating. This French philosopher masturbating on the front porch. And the people that were living at the Telluride house came running out and they're like, it's okay. He's French. He's a French philosopher.
That makes it okay?
And then they're like, okay, and they left. But if you take a tour of the Telluride house, this famous French philosopher that wrote a lot about sexuality and all these different things was at Cornell. And they always tell that story about him being caught by campus security masturbating out overlooking Large Slope.
Yeah, he's a weird guy. But, if you thought that truth was historically produced, you might be able to get away with a lot in your daily life, right?
But I think it's funny that, the thing that got him off was, don't worry, he's French and he's a philosopher. Okay.
Okay, he can do it then. Mm-hmm. So, back to the history of rhetoric. Now the church moving from Rome into sort of medieval period and into the early modern period, we have different understandings of rhetoric. This is a wonderful depiction of St. Augustine. I've never seen him look so James Bond. Here he is. And Augustine was one of the early church fathers, and he was a late convert to Christianity. He converted when he was older, so he eventually became a bishop and all this. But before that, he was a rhetoric teacher. He taught language, and he has this funny thing in Confessions about how terrible it is to teach students and how they're always goofing off and they never do the reading. And they're never prepared for class. And
preach it, brother.
Yeah, it was a very long time ago. So people were like, oh, it's all these phones and computers. I'm like, here, read this. Like, what were they doing? They're just, it's just the way people are. So he said, he was a big advocate of we should not dismiss things just because they're pagan. And some of these things could really help us get converts for the church. And so he wrote about rhetoric and studied rhetoric quite a bit. And he defined rhetoric as the art of teaching, pleasing, and moving. Not like moving like, hey, do you have a pickup truck? I got these boxes. But like getting people to do something, to move from their current position to something else, to move the audience. Now, I always thought that was a really cool definition because it really sums up all the things that we do with our words. So my challenge for you is to think like Augustine maybe tomorrow when you're talking to people and see, am I teaching, am I pleasing, am I moving, what am I doing right now talking to this person? Chances are you're probably doing one of those three things. Anytime you talk to anybody. I mean, I'm doing one of them right now, but I don't know which one. Over here is Sir Francis Bacon. He's a very famous thinker, scientist, writer, did a lot of things. He was English.
Inventor of bacon.
Well, I don't know about that. Definitely stylish. Much more stylish than Quintilian. Look at this collar. Look at the hat. Very cool. He's definitely from Queens. Dressed so stylishly like that. Not one of these Brooklyn hipsters that we all should despise.
Does anybody know what the conspiracy about Sir Francis Bacon is?
Do you think he was Shakespeare?
Some people do. Mm-hmm. He wrote Shakespeare under, false name.
That was his false name, yeah. So he said that rhetoric was the application of reasons to the imagination for the better moving of the will, which I think is a pretty good definition of advertising, if you think about it. Like, what does an ad do? It applies different reasons. Here's some things about our product to the imagination. It puts you in a scenario. You watch the people in the advertisement on TV going through a scenario you could find yourself in. And then you say, oh my gosh, if I don't have that, I'm not going to be able to do the things those people are doing. I better go get it. So it's sort of the very first sort of advertising consultancy definition. Reasons, the imagination for better moving of the will. So then we get into rhetoric's, what people call rhetoric's demise. I don't know how accurate that is, but this is Peter Ramus, who was a French thinker, and he was killed in St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, grading papers. The students came up and they found him and threw him out of the window during this big riot, this giant riot of French Catholics and French Protestants fighting each other.
Students killed him.
Yep.
You don't get any ideas.
Yeah, they were they raced up there and they were like, he's one of those horrible people, and threw him out the window. Defenestrated is the fancy word for that. He wrote a book about Quintilian, his doctoral dissertation, and he basically said the perfect rhetoric would be to have no rhetoric at all. So he said rhetoric has been misunderstood, and what it should be is sort of packaging for truths that are determined in philosophy. So he sort of reversed what Cicero said, which is that rhetoric is the place you go to say things about philosophy, or to say things about law, or to say things about science. Aristotle too. And he reversed it. He's like, rhetoric makes all these realizations from other fields sound pretty, sound reasonable, sound good. So he's the person, Peter Ramus is kind of treated like the Darth Vader of rhetoric, and he's sort of like kills all the good, all the good out of rhetoric, kills them all, and begins the empire where rhetoric is confined to like Dagobah and the desert planet of Tatooine. Right. So
and the basement of Godfall.
Yeah. So Ramus was incredibly influential to the point that rhetoric became nothing but style, nothing but how do you hold and position your body. How do you control your voice? How do you pronounce things beautifully? How do you chill your R's? This became the elocutionary movement in rhetoric, and it became all ideas and the generation of ideas and thought became the province of other disciplines, the sciences, which were on the ascendance in the 1600s. Philosophy, which was changing itself and becoming less about understanding the world and more about understanding human perception of the world and human ethics. So rhetoric became sort of the packaging. We think about that today. We think about debate as the place where we take our fully formed ideas to display them. We don't think of debate as like a science lab, where we go to test ideas or to discover what we don't know or to generate knowledge, which is another conception of debate or discussion that we don't have. So we're like, oh, they did poorly in the debate. That means their thoughts are poorly formed. They don't know anything. Whereas we might think of it as a place where we find ideas. So as this time went by, we have the Scottish Enlightenment. And this was in Edinburgh, and they had different people, like Campbell here. That art or talent by which discourse is adapted to its end. So we have this pragmatic understanding about it again. Is the meaning comes from somewhere else. Rhetoric helps get meaning across. So rhetoric becomes like an antenna or a radio, microphone. It becomes sort of the technology of transferring knowledge between people. That's a very different understanding than Gorgias's. Very different from Aristotle. Very different from all these other people.
How many people have taken a communication class in this class? Anyway, did they ever talk about like sender, receiver? Yeah, that's like in most basic communication classes they use this model.
Yeah. So there's books from the 19th century where you can find that say if you want the audience to feel sad, stand this way. And it shows you how to stand. The idea was that your body position could make the audience feel that way. Or here's how to move your arm for maximal effectiveness of communicating the emotion in your speech. Things like this.
Here's a good movement. I own some of these books because I collect old books. Here's a good movement if you want people to show that you're in despair.
Yep.
While you're speaking, you gotta put your wrist on your forehead. And people are like, oh, they're really upset.
This continued for a long time was the study of rhetoric as performance, not as meaning, but just as how to keep your feet, how to project your voice, like theater, almost like theater. And a lot of and theater departments were combined until rhetoric's great resurgence in the 20th century, which started here at Cornell University.
Yeah, that's what I'm talking. Big Red. Way to represent.
Yeah. So this is Herbert Wilchelms, English professor. He taught at Cornell for 40 years. I have the book that was presented to him. I have a copy of the book that was presented to him upon his retirement, which is his fundamental essay, which is towards the literary criticism of oratory. And he said, look, we do all this literary criticism. We find all these great things in poems and plays. Could we do literary criticism of speeches, like presidential speeches or political speeches? And then he and his students rediscovered Aristotle's book, which had kind of been sitting in the library. Nobody really thought much of it. And they were like, hey, maybe we could use this as a way to offer speech criticism. This would be like the Matthew Arnold for speeches. This could be like the way to see what's in speeches. So this is his quote from that. Rhetorical criticism is necessarily analytical. It's not just saying, oh, I like this or I like that of the speech. But it's analytical. Here's what the speaker did. Here's the effect in the audience. Or here's what the audience liked. Here's what we know about the audience. Here's what we know about the speaker. And this kind of work is still done today. Rhetorical criticism is still done today. People write about speeches all the time.
And you're going to do that in this class
yeah.
as well. You're going to write a rhetorical criticism at the end of class. I have a quick question. Look at that dude's picture. Could he be, you've all had Cornell professors, couldn't he fit into the faculty today? Same dress and everything. Maybe a little bit more modern glasses, put a European style on him.
I should scan in the picture of him at retirement to you. This is when he was like,
yeah,
at the height of his powers.
I would be like, if someone's like, is that dude a Cornell professor? I'd be like, yes, he could be hired today. He looks like a Cornell professor.
He actually looks to me like one of the scientists who may be working either for or against Captain America. Like in these superhero movies.
Yeah.
So I don't know if that gels with the Cornell ethos,
Yes,
but
definitely.
I don't know. But he either could be, it's like, and the whole time I was working for Hydra right under your nose, Captain. Ta-da! And then he has to like fight him, but he has some like special power. I don't know.
But, yeah, I mean, I don't know.
These movies are all kind of the
seems
same.
like a Cornell professor.
Yeah. So you also had to conceive of speeches as not being trivial, but actually having persuasive effect. It's kind of the minimum buy-in. So you can't be a cynic, a complete cynic, and study rhetoric, is what he's saying. You can't just think these speeches are like not influential. They have to have some influence, even if it's the influence of being like, oh, I'm tired of these stupid presidential speeches, whatever. So he started a movement that was founded here at Cornell, which is the Neo-Aristotelian movement. And that was people looking at speeches and saying, these speeches are more than just the communication of facts from other things. They're actually having a profound influence and impact on people. So that is the start of the 20th century. And the 20th century rhetoricians are a good-looking group of guys. That's all I have to say. I mean, they are like, be careful. Look out, ladies. Here they come. From under a slimy rock in the river come the troglodyte troll rhetoricians. No, I'm just kidding. I love these people. This is I.A. Richards. He's one of my favorite people. And he said he's a British philosopher. And he wanted to make English easy for foreigners to study. So he proposed a dictionary that was only like 600 words. He's like, we should just have a 600-word dictionary. And that's it. And then he also pioneered emoticons. Because he said, in writing, it's difficult to get tone. So we should put little symbols when we're being sarcastic or when we're being genuine. And I think that's what emoticons are now, right? Like if somebody says something really mean to you, like, yeah, you're the ugliest person I know, and then they're like, everything's okay. Like, you know, your foot looks crusty and horrific, but it's like, okay, that's great. But sometimes you accidentally mistype, and I accidentally mistype the winky frown, and that's a weird, like nobody's like in the world, that's a weird expression, but I do it all the time accidentally on Facebook Messenger and stuff. But he said we should mark our discourse with that, because in English, there's really no other way to tell. So that's kind of like the first emoticons. And he said, to study miscommunication, its remedies, which my department, we were formed in 2008, and we were like, what should we name ourselves? Department of Rhetoric? I said, we should name ourselves the Department of Miscommunication after I.A. Richards. And I was like serious about it, but everyone just laughed. All the other professors laughed. And I'm like, no, I'm serious, because we don't study when communication works well. Like, how many books have been written on, Sam, could you please get the lights? And then he gets up and does it, right? Nobody's going to write a book about that. People are going to be like, Sam, will you please get the lights? And Sam goes out and gets starts making pipe bombs in the hallway or something. It's like, I thought the revolution was on, and then it's like this horrible tragedy or something. I mean, that's the thing people study, right? People always study miscommunication. Think about how many hours, like anytime there's an airplane accident, how many hours are spent looking for that flight recorder. What was the last thing said in the cockpit? As if that's going to change something somehow. But we want to know that miscommunication so it won't happen again. Did the tower tell them the wrong thing? What was it? So we don't write books on airlines as like, it left Shanghai at noon and it arrived in California perfectly on time and everyone had a good time. And why did this happen? Let's look at the communication. Nobody does that. Nobody looks at that. So he's on to something. This is Kenneth Burke. This is probably the most influential 20th century rhetorician.
And best looking.
And one of the best looking. Here he is trying to learn how to tie a tie without a mirror. No, I don't know what he's doing. He's being creepy. But he always has a really weird picture of himself on all his book covers, so don't be frightened if you go buy the book and you're like, ah! But he was interesting. He was sort of a self-educated guy. He worked in New York at little magazines writing literary criticism and things like that. He was a poet and a writer and a music critic, and all of his stuff is good. But then he decided to write a trilogy of books about human communication, which he called Dramatism. Dramatism was his unifying theory. He wanted to be like Karl Marx or Sigmund Freud or something like that. Have a unifying theory of what motivates us. So for Karl Marx, the unifying theory of what motivates us is what? How can human history be explained for Karl Marx?
The struggle between the working class and owners, landowners.
Yeah, very good. Between people who are at the top and the bottom, they struggle and history moves forward. Right? And so communism is the end of history. No more history when we reach a communistic state because it's the end of struggle, so everything will always remain the same. So it's sort of like, almost like the pre-apocalyptic Fallout world where everybody stayed at 1950s technology. I don't know if you play that video game. But everybody stayed at 1950s technology all the way through, except it was just really cool because there wasn't any real development. So it's sort of like a Marxist kind of idea. And then for Sigmund Freud, what was the unifying motive or story of humanity? What motivates us? How can we describe humans from Freud's point of view? No? Nobody wants to say it.
What would you guess if there was $100,000 on the table, and you had to guess?
Ooh, there might be.
Why Sigmund Freud? Yeah. What his unifying theory was that explains everything.
Like if Marx was, it's all about class struggle. What's Freud's?
And say it out loud.
It's all about childhood. No.
Yeah, well, I think that's one way of saying it. But it's all highly sexualized. Everything is about sexual energy and sexual desire, and that explains childhood. But also, a lot of your mind is not known to you, the unconscious.
No one in
your motives are not fully known to you. This is his big innovation. So for Marx, the big innovation was a new way of talking about history. For Freud, it was a new way of talking about the mind. Both of whom are incredibly influential at Burke, who's working in the 1950s. Both of those ideas are really coming along very influentially for him. And for Freud, it was like almost everything is sexual, and you don't know how deep it goes, which was a new idea. Most people thought that all of their desires and motives were perfectly apparent to them. He said, no, you have an unconscious, and the unconscious is a part of your desires that you will never know. You have no access to it, but it is structured like a language and can be understood. And that was what Freud said the unconscious was.
Haven't you ever heard the phrase, that was a Freudian slip?
Yep.
It's not like a woman's undergarment. A Freudian slip is when
it's like a brand.
I'll tell you one that I said, I wanted this guy and this girl debating together, and I said, now that you are having success, but instead I said, now that you are having sex, right? And they're like, Freudian slip.
Yep.
And then I was like, well, couldn't it have just been a slip? Right? And they're like, no. But they're like, we're not having sex. And I'm like, I know, and I don't think it was a Freudian slip, but that was the whole.
But you wanted them to. It did something.
No, I did not. See, this is the problem with Freud, that they always say, you're slipping what your subconscious really wants, but you don't know it. But that's what you really want. And so you can't be like, no, I didn't really want that, because they're like, denial. That's more proof that you really wanted it. And then you're like, no, really, I'm not in denial. Denial of denial.
Yeah.
Even deeper.
Yeah.
Right? Like, you so bad want those two to have sex right now that you're denying that you're denying. And it's like you're trapped. And this is all Freudian psychology. I don't know, perhaps we should just teach the rest of the class about Freud.
We could.
Yeah.
I love Freud, so I could go on and on about him, but I won't. But I will say that identification is the big definition of rhetoric that Burke has. I put some of his famous quotes. Rhetoric is the realm of the subsidized lie, which I think is a cool line. Think about what a subsidized lie would be. A lie with help. Rhetoric helps your lie not look like a lie. But rhetoric is the realm of the scramble, the realm of cloaked malice. I think that's kind of cool. And then rhetoric is forever proving opposites. And this is where he draws in Aristotle. It's this idea that rhetoric is taking one idea and saying this is the best one and then turning around and doing the other side. Which is one of the things the sophists enjoyed doing to drum up business for their clients. They'd say, give me a topic. And then give them like just 5 or 10 minutes to prepare. And then they would just make an argument. And then they would say, at any time you say switch, I'll change sides. And then they would do it. And it's like, wow, how do you do that? And they're like, for $100 a month, I'll teach you. And then Plato and Socrates are like, this is disgusting. They should be teaching them truth, not how to play games with ideas. And the sophists would say, that is the truth. Playing games with ideas is what being a person is all about. And it's awesome. And that's what we should be doing. Right? That is the battle. But, forever proving opposites. You take one thing, and then you prove the opposite, and you can prove the opposite, and you can prove the opposite, you can prove the opposite ad infinitum. But for Burke, it's identification. Rhetoric is not about persuasion or oral discourse, but it's about me wanting to be a part of something. And then acting as if I'm already a part of it, or trying to have you identify me as a part of it. dressing a certain way, speaking a certain way, acting a certain way. At the same time, you are compulsorily dividing from other things. So identification, division, one movement for Kenneth Burke. And that's the heart of rhetoric, is identification. I want to be something other. And rhetoric is the entire situation of action and motive and speech and performance that will get you there. That's probably one of the most influential definitions that's out there. But Burke's unifying theory was that humans are best understood as participating in drama, like theater. Everything is seen as a play. So we're always trying to figure out, just like when you watch a play or a movie, you're always trying to figure out the character's motives. And once you figure out their motives, it allows you access to an attitude to have about them. So at first you hate somebody, and then you see a tender moment with their puppy. And you're like, oh man, I feel bad that I hated them. It changes their attitude, right? The change in motives comes with the corresponding change in attitude. And that, writ large, is the way that politics plays out. So he had a lot of interesting ideas of politics. In fact, in the early 1930s, he wrote an essay called The Rhetoric of Hitler's Battle. Hitler was like an unknown quantity. He had just been elected chancellor. Nobody was really paying very much attention to him, especially in the United States. And Burke read his book, Mein Kampf. And he wrote The Rhetoric of Hitler's Battle. And he says, Adolf Hitler is a medicine man peddling some pretty nasty medicine in Germany. Let's take a look at what medicine man this shaman is cooking up in hopes to inoculate, like what Sam was saying earlier about inoculate Americans against the medicine man doing the same thing here. Pretty relevant essay to be reading in the days when Donald Trump is pulling all this support, right? Kind of a relevant thing to read. What kind of inoculation would you need against the medicine man who's making a kind of a bad medicine? The Rhetoric of Hitler's Battle. Pretty interesting stuff.
10 minutes.
All right, so I'm going to go ahead and just finish with this slide. I have a few more, but I'm not going to send Sam the PowerPoint if you guys want it.
No, I want it. Don't you want to see the rest of the PowerPoint? I'll share it with the whole class.
Okay, well, I can move through. I wanted to save some time for conversation.
Well, let's go through the whole 10 minutes, and then we'll keep them in an hour or two afterwards class.
I thought we were going to go to the asylum tonight. No?
Perhaps.
No, let's do that. All right, so this is a breakdown of what you can do as a rhetorician today. Traditional rhetoric, which is the study of speeches, the study of oral discourse, mostly political. I have a lot of friends who do this. They study President Obama. They study campaign speeches. They study speeches in times of crisis, when a big national crisis happens. How do politicians respond? How do leaders respond? And what's the most effective way to do that? That seems pretty practical. Rhetoric of inquiry. This is the study of the rhetoric of knowing things. So in medicine or philosophy or economics, how do they rhetorically frame themselves as an engine of knowledge creation? How do they legitimize themselves? Everything that you study had a time when it wasn't considered to be a legitimate study. At some point, somebody came along and said, here's how we are legitimate inquiry. And that's like the rhetoric of history, the rhetoric of science, the rhetoric of economics. Rhetoric of space and place. This is the study of things of, like, how do people arrange things like a classroom to make us persuaded that it's a classroom so we behave like students and teachers? How do we design a hospital to make people feel like it's a clean place, even though the risk of secondary infection is incredibly high in the United States? And chances are after surgery you might die from secondary infection, right? A vast number of people do. But how do we make it look persuasively clean, and how do we make it look like doctors know what they're doing, even though they might not? Or how do we arrange a museum that's in memory of something? This is very, very interesting if you look at the controversy of the September 11th Memorial Museum in New York City and the public battles over what should be in the museum and how it should be organized. Totally fascinating. I was lucky enough to go to a talk that 3 of the designers of that museum gave about why they designed it the way they did. And I'll just go ahead and spoil it right now. They used Freudian principles of trauma to guide their design of the museum. So if you look to Freud's theory of how trauma works, Freud had 2 sons. They both went and fought in World War I. He was terrified that they wouldn't come home. So to assuage himself, he went to the Veterans Hospital and volunteered. He was a medical doctor. And volunteered to help the people coming back from the front lines, Austrians coming back from the front lines. And there were these guys who were perfectly fine, but they couldn't sleep at night because they would wake up screaming and stuff like that. He's like, what's wrong with them? So Freud is sort of the first identifier of PTSD, which was called at the time shell shock. Right? They imagined themselves being shelled, or anytime they heard a loud noise, they would flip out. And so he's like, this tells us more about the mind's understanding of trauma than we knew. He wrote a whole essay about it. It's really fascinating. How to treat them. How does the human body move through a trauma? And these designers were influenced by that and designed the 9/11 Museum of the stages of trauma. So every room is like a move through a different stage. Really cool.
By the way, we have a whole major here. It's called Design and Environmental Analysis.
Yeah.
This is what they do.
You'll read a lot of stuff about this kind of stuff in that.
And recently, I just tell you one real quick kind of interesting story. They were like trying to figure out, because kids are really scared to get an MRI. You put them in a machine, it's very scary. And some professor here figured out how to make kids want to get in the MRI machine. Does anybody know how they did it?
Cattle prod.
No.
I'm out of ideas.
They made it look like a spaceship. And they're like, get into the spaceship. You're going to blast off. You're going to hear the noise. That's the engines. And they made it like a game. And the kids are like, cool, can I go again? But before that, the kids are like, no, don't put me in there. Right? And it's like one simple change. And it's a different frame now. Right? And that's rhetoric.
Yep, absolutely.
Different attitude change.
Yep.
Right? It's a spaceship. It's fun.
So visual rhetoric is the study of things like film, pictures, images, and can they be rhetorical? Can a picture argue? Can a picture be persuasive? That's what they study. More controversial when it seems. And then critical rhetoric is the study of rhetoric from a critical social justice perspective. Rhetoric has the ability to take down forces of domination and oppression or build them up. And that it's not just a neutral study of it. Isn't that interesting how that leader condemned 5,000 of his own people to death based on a whim? Isn't that interesting? Let me write an article about it. It's more of the study of how can we, as rhetoricians with this power, engage in the critique of domination and the practice of freedom. And a lot of people do that. So let me quickly kind of go through these things. Traditional rhetoric, like I said, is history of rhetoric, free speech, Supreme Court rhetoric, looking at Supreme Court cases and saying, what if Supreme Court decisions are seen as rhetorical? They're persuasive documents that make us believe the court has power and the court has influence. How can we see them structuring it in a way to make their decisions legitimate? So it's like that idea that the Supreme Court justices pretty much come to a decision and then they look to the law to justify what they think is good. Not the way we would hope they would do it, which is look to the law, see what the law says, and follow the law. They come to a decision and they're like, oh yeah, I can find evidence for that. Very much like how you write a paper 2 days before it's due. You're like, here's my idea, let me go find evidence to support that idea. Is that legitimate? Or should it be this more like noble democratic process of like, I read all the books with an open mind and I came to the decision of like which one's more legitimate? They study that. And then presidential rhetoric. There's Abe Lincoln, the inventor of the boombox and breakdancing as well. Rhetoric of inquiry. I have a friend who does studies of MRI stuff and how this is a completely constructed image to persuade you that there's activity in the brain. If you looked at this without the coloring, which is added by media, you would just see shades of gray, and you need a degree in radiology to be able to distinguish whether or not that gray is effective. Also, you also have to believe the connection that increased blood flow means more brain activity, because that's all these things measure. So you have, men and women watch a Donald Trump campaign ad, and their brains light up differently. You're like, Donald Trump has more of an effect on men than women. It's in your brain. But you have to buy the argument that increased blood flow means that part of the brain is acting up, and not something else is happening.
So
and it's also, the red and the blue, the distinction between the red and the blue is really great in the color, but in the actual image before it's colored, that distinction would probably be unnoticeable to our eyes, which is interesting. It's also the rhetoric of science. Here's Galileo explaining that the Earth is not the center of everything. Copernican idea to a very angry monk. Here's a famous historian talking about history. And Watson and Crick, the inventors of DNA. And I say the inventors, not the discoverers, because this image of DNA has never been seen. This is a theoretical model of how DNA has to work, given the evidence of what we know about it. So it's rhetoric. It's persuasive model that says this is what we think it looks like, but this can't be seen like this. But we have the evidence that it must be structured like this. So here's what it must look like, even though your eye could never apprehend it. So it's interesting to think of science as persuasive, rather than science as the discovering of objective knowledge. And that's what rhetoric of inquiry is all about. Space and place. Who gets to decide how we memorialize a conflict in our country or war? Who gets to decide? So this is the Korean War memorial, and this is the Vietnam memorial. Look at the distinction between these two memorials. Huge, right? Huge. Is there much of a distinction between the Korean War and the Vietnam War? I mean, you would say, well, there's a huge distinction here. What's the, you know, and then also museums. How do we decide how to put art in the museum? It's a political choice. Curators fight about this all the time. What should come first? How should we present it? What should be on this wall? What should be on that wall? The movement through a museum, how is that determined? People study this kind of thing. And it becomes even more high stakes when you have things like the 9/11 Museum or the U.S. Holocaust Museum and things like that. That becomes really, really important and really political. Or when the Enola Gay, the plane that dropped the nuclear weapons on Japan, was given to, I think, the Smithsonian? Or is it the National Air and Space Museum?
Smithsonian.
There was a huge controversy of whether they should even display that at all. And how should we display it? How should we speak about what it did? Should we glorify it? Should we regret it? What should we do? And then everybody has an opinion. Did you have something to say?
Oh, yeah. Why did they have the Korean War memorial like that?
I don't know. That would be something that rhetoricians would research and say, what was their argument about presenting it this way? And then how do audiences read it over time? Do any of you know anybody who fought in the Korean War? Now, there's an interesting piece of data. Oh, you do?
Yeah.
Who?
My grandfather.
Your grandfather. And who do you know, Sam?
My dad.
Oh, you see, that's a generational difference. Now, how would that affect the interpretation of that memorial, that connection, or that lack of connection? Right? Like, what happened in the Korean War? How did it turn out? All that kind of stuff is important to know. And Vietnam as well, which we know more of. And then thinking about the wars of our time, the Iraq War and Afghani War, how will these be memorialized? That's something that we all have. How many of you know someone who served in Afghanistan or Iraq? Yeah, almost all of us, right? So that's much more. And then you think your kids, what are your kids going to think about those conflicts? Are they going to have, and then their kids are going to be even more distant from that. So it's interesting to think about what's at stake in those things. Visual rhetoric is, can pictures argue? What are these pictures about? Can anybody recognize these pictures and say something about them? What they're from? Yeah, you can choose anyone you want and just talk about it. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I know the picture, down there, that's from, the Grapes of Wrath.
Mm-hmm.
And it talks about, how, poverty, it kind of just shows, the desolation people were in after, I think it was the Dust Bowl.
Yep, the Dust Bowl, right? This picture is from the Great Depression. Dust Bowl, FDR gave a bunch of money to go out and chronicle and take pictures, and this is a very famous picture of Great Depression, Dust Bowl, the extreme poverty Americans faced at the time.
By a famous woman photographer named Dorothea Lange.
That's right. Mm-hmm. Government photographer. People don't know. She was paid by the federal government. Anybody else? What are these other pictures? Yeah?
From the World Trade Center, the firefighters were, I guess they found the American flag and they were raising it. And I'm from New York City, and that photo has just been seen everywhere. And during the time when it was being circulated, I was young. I was in the 5th grade, but it was huge.
It's everywhere.
It just meant I guess what we symbolize unity and
Well, this picture was taken on September 12th, 2001.
Yeah, it was the day after.
And they found this. They were putting this makeshift flag up. This photo is called Ground Zero Spirit. It's very famous. It won a lot of photography awards. The other photos that circulate from 9/11 don't circulate as well as this one. There's another one called Falling Man. It's somebody leaping out of the World Trade Center. That photo circulated a bit, but that one stopped circulating. This one continues to circulate. Anybody know this photo? Yep.
It's Vietnam. I can't. It's just after the. I always screw up the name of the. Is it the My Lai massacre?
No, there's a famous photo from My Lai massacre, but it was taken by an Australian photographer, and it was right before the order was given to kill all these people. He took a picture of them and then walked away because he didn't want the Americans to detain him.
Yeah.
And they were kill everybody. So it's these women looking really panicked. But this photo is called Napalm Girl, and this woman is actually still alive. She's an American citizen now. But this is a village has been hit with napalm, and these children are running out, and she has incredibly bad, you can't see it in this photo, but maybe on her arm, incredibly bad burns from the napalm. They burned off all of her clothes, and she's coming out. And this became sort of the emblematic photo of how to think about Vietnam. Look at the children and how much pain and horror they're in, and look at the attitude of the American soldiers. Look at this guy. What's he doing? Is he getting a cigarette out, or is he reloading his gun? What's he doing? Like another day in the office, right? So it's when these images circulate, they come with them a host of judgments, or as Burke would say, identifications, divisions, motives, and their corresponding attitudes, which then can shape public policy. From a photo, public policy can be shaped.
Napalm is like a gel that is left on you, and it burns you. It's designed to burn you. So when you get hit by a bomb,
like a
you
chemical
get a gel on you like a chemical burn.
Yeah, really nasty stuff. But she's still alive. There was an interview with her. This picture just turned a certain, I forget how old it is, but she's like an old lady. She lives in the U.S. now.
Yeah, I think
there's an interview online about her life. It's kind of cool. Critical rhetoric, the study of how rhetoric influences our way of thinking about justice, right and wrong, oppression. How sometimes oppression can feel like a good thing, like if you've ever read 1984 or Brave New World. Oppression and injustice can feel like a great thing. And how do people feel like what they're doing is just when it might be causing huge amounts of damage to other groups of people? So critical rhetoric is the study of how rhetoric can be used in the service of social justice, things like that. So there are some challenges to rhetorical tradition, and I'll go over these really quick. The author of your textbook wrote this other public speaking textbook because Foss and Griffin wrote an essay about Sally Earhart, who's a feminist thinker. She wrote an essay about how every attempt to persuade is an act of violence. So anytime you get up to persuade anyone, you're committing a violent, patriarchal act where you discount the life experiences and the knowledge of the people you're trying to persuade. And like an invading force, you come into their mind and say, here's how you're going to think and be from now on. So any act to persuade is an act of violence. So she's very dismissive of the rhetorical tradition that I've talked to you about tonight. Not only dismissive, but she thinks it's actively harmful. So what's the alternative to that? Well, something that wouldn't be, I know more than you, let me convince you the right thing to do. And so they tried to, through this idea, Foss and Griffin had this idea of invitational rhetoric, which is much more of a sharing, participatory mode of persuasion, where everyone's invited to contribute as the rhetor. Not this firm distinction like I'm performing here tonight, where I assume you don't know anything about rhetoric and I know everything right about rhetoric. And like an invading force, I'm sort of like re-educating you about the new order, the new economy, the new way to think, the new values, the new gods. And this is their public speaking book, which is how to do this kind of speech without being this way, being oppressive this way. And this is Dilip Gankar, who's a professor at Northwestern. And he wrote a very influential essay that says, our study of rhetoric, based on Aristotle, is incredibly limiting. Aristotle was all about how it's about the production of rhetoric. And we want to use him to critique rhetoric. And we use all this French theory to critique rhetoric. And what we need to do is really think very carefully about the study of rhetoric and what it is that we're saying to critique it, what it is that we are saying to about it. We've expanded it well far beyond its initial understanding. And that expansion has made us miss the possibilities of rhetoric as production. So rhetoric wasn't originally designed to be critical, to use it as a criticism of saying, here's what Jeb Bush did right and wrong. Here's what rhetoric can say about this persuasive message and how it works. That wasn't, that the texts are pushed beyond their limits. Aristotle and Cicero, we push them beyond their limits. They're really for constructing rhetoric. And so his critique is dealt with quite a bit. People write a lot about that. And where we should go if we're going to do criticism, we should not look to rhetorical thinkers to do that. I think that's probably where I'd like to end. I don't want to keep you too long.
What I'd like to do is invite anybody that would like to stay around and have a discussion with me and Professor Yano. You know, like, there's probably a few students that have questions. So we'll hang out.
Yep. Thank you, guys.
Thank you. Let's hear it for Professor Yano. Please clap.
Please clap. I should have did it that way. That would have been really funny. Please clap.